were you able to see the notes as far as Mr. Broderick's description of his wife when she first saw Dr. Zedimer?
I was able to see what Dr. Zedimer had said had happened sometime before that admission.
Okay, and that was that she was having some extreme problems with depression and acting out.
When he first took her there, yes.
Now, when you reviewed Dr. Nelson's testimony, he indicated that depression was significant that he saw. Is that correct?
I thought Dr. Nelson said that depression was not the primary issue for her.
Well, did he indicate that it wasn't pathological, but it was significant? You remember his testimony about the depression?
Your Honor, I've asked
Say it.
to show the transcript.
Well, if he doesn't remember, then I'll show him the transcript itself. Page 735. His answer.
He's saying statistically significant.
And that's your reading that he felt it was statistically significant?
He's talking about how many standard deviations from the mean.
Now, what?
But he goes on in the same sentence to say, but it's not the overriding issue in her personality.
Okay. But it's a feature of her personality, is that correct? A feature of her makeup is depression.
Well, not of her makeup. See, people with any of the personality disorders can get depressed. And there were times Mrs. Broderick was depressed.
But she has been at least diagnosed at the hospital. The final diagnosis was on axis 1 of bipolar depression, was it not?
No, it was a bipolar mania,
Okay.
which is the opposite of depression.
Was there a diagnosis by was a bipolar affective disorder mixed? Is that correct? And that she was in the hypomanic phase at that time.
That's what they said, right? And based on what they knew,
That's all I'm
I may
asking.
have believed it, but that we know that's not so.
But that was their diagnosis at the time.
Based on the slice of life they saw right after ramming the door, that's what they thought.
Okay. And then there was another diagnosis given. Dr. Jacobson also gave a diagnosis, did he not? Jacobson, I'm sorry.
Yes, he said, well, I'm not sure what his ultimate diagnosis was. I saw that less than a month before ramming the door, he wrote, "As for now, Betty keeps busy enough to not be seriously depressed."
Did, at some point, did you get any information that well, first of all, what is the definition of the bipolar disorders?
Bipolar disorder is diagnosed when someone has had one or more manic episodes. This is a change from the older idea of manic depressive illness. It used to be thought that, well, what is now thought is that there is a condition known as bipolar affective illness in which people become manic, and they are then at risk of being people who will become depressed. Mania is a condition in which people have excessive energy, feel too powerful, don't feel a need for sleep. They have increased energy, increased sex drive, may do various things to excess, and may also become psychotic. If someone has had an episode of behavior that meets a particular list of criteria for mania, then they receive the diagnosis of bipolar, but it doesn't mean that they have ever been depressed. You can be bipolar without having been depressed.
Okay. Some of the areas for manic is that or manic episode is inflated self-esteem or grandiosity, is it not?
That's one.
Okay. More talkative than usual or pressure to keep talking.
Yes.
Okay. The flight of ideas is subjective experience, thoughts that are racing.
Yes.
Do you see those at all in Elizabeth Broderick?
Well, there are things that make one have to consider that. There are times that that she was very energetic. There certainly was evidence of her having some grandiosity. None of it reached the proportions that I think qualify for a manic episode, nor was the duration of this cluster of features such that I think it would qualify. I don't think anyone ever said that they thought she had a true manic episode, but at the time of that hospitalization, they thought she was hypomanic. Now, that's a label that would be given to someone who's just very energetic and talks fast. And it's not an indication of particularly serious pathology. There are lots of highly functioning people who are hypomanic.
Well, she had, but that wasn't her final diagnosis, though, was it? Hypomanic.
I thought they said bipolar disorder mixed type hypomanic phase.
Yeah, the phase was hypomanic that she was in.
Right, and that's the only time anyone ever thought she was even hypomanic, let alone manic.
And you're saying that would be a diagnosis that you would give on Axis 1 if it only happens one time?
If someone had a manic episode, that would be a bipolar diagnosis on Axis 1. Pardon me?
Sorry for interrupting.
In the absence of some other explanation for why they acted that way.
Well, would that be a diagnosis as a that you would give that this person is bipolar? You would give the diagnosis that's here?
If what?
If there's only the one episode, that's it. You have the one episode, no evidence of other episodes. That would be a diagnosis that you would give.
If someone had one episode of true mania, it would be correct, ruling out other causes of that behavior, to give a diagnosis of bipolar, yes.
What is another indication is distractibility, attention too easily drawn to unimportant or irrelevant external stimuli. It's another factor that you would look for. Is that correct?
It is. That's one, of course, Mrs. Broderick never had. Nothing distracted her from her quest.
Okay. So whatever was on, whenever she was looking at something, there was never where she would divert her attention to things that were irrelevant to to her quest.
She was quite single-minded about getting revenge against Dan and Linda.
Excessive involvement in pleasurable activities, including buying sprees. Would that also be one that you would look at?
That's a feature of mania.
You didn't see any buying sprees on her part?
It looked like she was always buying.
And what would be the definition of And when they talk about the mood, is it not true that the predominant mood disturbance may be irritability and may be most apparent when the person is thwarted?
Yes.
The one of the associated features is that the person does not recognize that they're ill and they resist all efforts for treatment. Is that correct?
That's a feature of many conditions. It's true in mania as well, because they feel on top of the world and everything's perfect. They don't want to give up the symptom.
Another common associated feature is rapid shifts of mood to anger or depression.
In mania? Is that what we're looking at?
Yes.
Yes.
The depression may be expressed by tearfulness, suicidal threats that may last moments, hours, not often days or rarely days.
May I see what you're reading from?
Yes.
Right. Those are associated features, not criteria for the diagnosis.
Okay. Sometimes the depressive and manic symptoms can occur simultaneously, or they may alternate rapidly within a few days.
That can happen.
Now, when we talk about major depression, there's the associated symptoms include appetite disturbance and change in weight. Is that correct?
The associated symptoms of
A major depressive episode.
that may happen in a major depressive episode.
Okay.
But of course, that's not the most common cause for people gaining or losing weight.
Okay. But that's something that may happen.
Yes.
Change, sleep disturbance.
Yes.
Difficulty thinking or concentrating.
Yes.
Reoccurrent thoughts of death or suicidal ideation or attempts.
Right.
When you have, are you familiar with the term suicidal gesture?
Sure.
Okay, now there are times that people make an attempt or make a gesture at suicide that is not just to get attention, isn't there?
There are other reasons for suicide attempts and other reasons for suicidal gestures besides getting attention. Yes.
Sometimes you have people who do suicidal gestures. They'll have thoughts about wanting to die as a solution, but also have some very strong feelings about not wanting to die, to live. Isn't that correct?
That's something that can happen.
Okay, and that can have some effect about maybe where they might not be successful, or they may not do a very serious attempt at suicide. Would you agree with that?
If somebody's not sure they want to do it,
Yes.
yes, they may do various things to prevent it from being a real attempt.
Okay, and it may be part of the association, may be that they have a part of them that wants to die, and also it may be a way of getting attention or or manipulating somebody. Would you agree with that?
Yes, it could be all of those things at once.
When we talk about impairment in major depressive episodes, there's various degrees, is there not? There's various types of criterion that you look at.
There are particular levels of severity that are described in the manual.
You can have a major depressive episode, and there is a code that you would then put as to the level of the severity. Is that correct?
Right. These aren't used most of the time, but the code's available.
And one of the codes is mild, few if any symptoms in excess of those requiring a diagnosis. Symptoms result in only minor impairment or in occupational function or unusual social activities or relationships. That's one, is that correct?
Correct.
And even though you would have that, you can still have a major depressive episode and still have the mild, what appears to be mild symptoms to the outside world.
Not just the outside world, you can have a mild case of it.
Okay. And then there's a moderate, which is symptoms or functional impairment between mild and severe. Is that correct?
Right.
And then there's severe, several symptoms in excess of those required to make the diagnosis. And symptoms markedly interfere with occupational function or with social activities or relationships with others. Isn't that correct? That's what severe is.
That's right.
Okay. And when we're talking about severe, that means that somebody whose depression might be bad enough that they might not get out of bed or might not keep appointments or not go out socially because they're depressed. That would be more of the severe category. Interferes with their social activities.
Well, the cause of impairment in one's functioning has to be the depression.
Yes. Okay. Someone who may stay in their room at times when there's other people around or go off by themselves, that would be something that would be more of the severe because it interferes with their social activities, if it's related to the depression.
Someone who's severely depressed will often be withdrawn, will be unable to speak. People will have to come into the room and ask them if they're hungry and encourage them to eat. They will have to be spoon-fed and led to food some of the time. They will let themselves waste away without being encouraged to eat. May not have the energy to walk to the kitchen to get food, won't have the energy to walk into the bathroom and may stay in the bed. And people who are severely depressed are highly dysfunctional and can be completely withdrawn that way.
They'll find themselves walking from counter to counter, almost holding themselves up.
No, that's a more histrionic sort of behavior.
Okay. That's not has anything to do with depression.
Holding oneself up, walking.
No, in other words, if they don't have the energy, sometimes the people will find themselves going to a room and just sitting down or leaning against something just because they do not have energy to do things, going to the bathroom.
That can happen, but the real point is they feel too fatigued to do anything. They just feel absolutely overwhelmed and drained. Don't feel they have the energy to put on clothes. Don't feel they have the energy to tend to the chores. Don't feel they have the energy to do any of the things that they really ought to be doing.
Okay, and you can see that sometimes in their appearance, letting themselves go, not attending to themselves physically.
For prolonged periods of time, right?
Yeah.
And again, for it to be major depression, there have to be enough of these symptoms, I think it's 5 or more, simultaneously every day for weeks.
Well, doesn't the DSM-3 say almost every day?
And I think I've said that many times in my testimony too, every day or nearly every day.
Okay. And now people who also when people have some severe or are suffering from severe depression, different times of the day can give them different energy levels, can it not?
When they're suffering from what?
When they're suffering from severe depression.
Well, if they're suffering from a major depressive episode, time of day can make a difference. When it's severe enough, they may be incapacitated all day long.
Well, we go from severe to, then after that we go to the next phase with psychotic features. Is that correct?
That's not another phase, it's a separate dimension as to whether or not people are psychotic. The assumption underlying the classification is that one could have a mild case of depression and still be psychotic. That even though mostly functioning, one could still think that one's guts were rotting from the inside, or that the world was about to come to an end, and yet still function. But I think that truth is that mostly it's the severe depressions that are psychotic, where people think that everything horrible is happening and develop delusions. And certainly anybody who's got those kinds of delusions, I would call psychotically depressed and severely depressed.
Well, there's examples of people who have severe depression who function. Mike Wallace, for instance, is someone who has said that he's functioned, done interviews, been severely depressed, doesn't even remember what he did, but was on TV doing major things.
Well, he's not using the DSM-3R language when he calls that severe. He's describing his own estimate of severity. If he were still able to function, then psychiatrically, technically, it wouldn't be severe. But it's true that there are people with major depressive illness who function very well. Abraham Lincoln suffered from it.
And are you familiar with William Styron?
Not his diagnoses, no.
But are you familiar with who the person is?
Sort of embarrassed to say, I'm not sure, but I think he's a novelist.
Yeah, from Sophie's Choice. He also wrote Out of Darkness.
I don't know much about him. I've heard the name.
You're not familiar with his writings about suffering from depression and getting Pulitzer Prize, showing up, functioning on a day-to-day basis.
Objection, how's this relevant?
Sustained.
What are the criteria for a major depressive syndrome?
They're as set forth in DSM-3R.
Okay.
To have the, I'm sorry,
Okay, we've gone through some. One is the depressed mood nearly every day for as you indicated, a 2-week period.
right. But it has to be a prolonged period. It's not arbitrarily really 2 weeks, but there has to be a prolonged period of this multiplicity of symptoms simultaneously.
Okay, so it can be depending on all the symptoms. It can be as short as 2 weeks or longer.
That's right.
Okay. The significant weight loss or weight gain. That's one, is it not?
Yes.
Insomnia or hypersomnia nearly every day.
Yes.
The fatigue or loss of energy every day.
Right.
And some recurrent thoughts of death or recurrent suicidal ideation without a specific plan.
Right.
Okay. The now, when you were going through the does the feeling of helplessness or hopelessness, is that a concept that is in the area of depression?
Depressed people often have those features.
Okay, and what does that mean?
The perception of helplessness is the feeling that one really hasn't got control and that one can't take care of oneself. The feeling of hopelessness has to do with one's perceptions of the future and the feeling that the future doesn't hold out hope. that there's nothing to look forward to. It can occur in depression.
I think before we took the break, we were talking about cyclothymia.
I wasn't.
Okay. Was there a diagnosis at some point of that? Or at least from Dr. Jacobson?
Yes, that's right.
And what does that mean?
Cyclothymia is the condition of some moodiness in which one will have days that one feels very energetic and enthusiastic, maybe excessively so, wanting to take other people out after work, wanting to do more than you expect the person to want to do. And other days they're feeling down and leave work early or don't feel like they have much energy or think things are bad. But it never reaches the extremes of being a major depression or, in the other direction, a manic episode. It's a more minor vacillation of moods between feeling better and feeling worse. It's not incapacitating. Medications usually aren't even used to treat it, and it's a fairly common condition.
The when you look at Elizabeth Broderick's personality disorder, I take it that you feel that it colors her way of looking at things. Would that be a good description?
It colors her way of responding to things.
And some of that, the way she responds to it, some of it is maybe based on prior incidences that she's been involved in, or that have happened to her.
That's true for everyone, yes.
When you read her diaries, did you run across any writings about the fact that, where she talked about hiding the affair and problems with Dan from the children, and that was going to be something that she didn't feel she wanted to do anymore?
I recall at least one mention of that. I don't recall where it was.
The you indicated that there were some examples of manipulation, and those were ones that you remembered with the children. Is that correct? Remembered some manipulation with the children.
Got many, many examples of manipulation with the children.
And that's something that happens in divorces at times, does it not?
Well, not to this extent.
But it happens in
Sure.
divorces at times, isn't that correct?
Yes.
Both sides can manipulate the children by putting them in the middle.
Yes.
There is, you found within her examples of lack of empathy.
I found evidence that she lacks empathy, yes.
Okay. Now, some of that can relate back to at least the circumstances that have happened to her in the past, where she might overreact in the future to those things. In other words, if there's a set of circumstance that something has happened to her that's bad, she might overreact to that in the future by not having empathy towards her reaction might have towards third people.
Well, lack of empathy isn't an over response, it's an under response. The lack of empathy is her not concerning herself with how other people will feel about what she does to them.
The, one of the examples that you've given is the fact that she, at least in your diagnosis, is the fact that she was preoccupied with envy, looking for how Dan and Linda were living. Looking at Dan and Linda as to their lifestyle and envious of that.
Right.
Your Honor.
As you can stand, go ahead.
The fact is that during this period of time, she was going through litigation with them, wasn't she?
Not for the entire period that she was feeling envious. Well, I guess there were some unresolved issues still.
Okay. Well, until 1989, there was no resolution of any of the property matters, was there?
At the time of the homicides, I thought a lot of things were resolved.
In the 1989, January of 89, up until the 5 years or 4 years up to January of 1989, she had been through a divorce where there had been no resolution, where the property issues had not been resolved.
Objection, Your Honor. I don't think, it misstates the evidence on the basis of that.
Sustained.
Well, when you're looking at how someone reacts to something, whether they're envious, one of the situations is that that you looked at, wasn't there, that there were property issues that were being litigated? Isn't that correct?
Not exactly. I mean, I was aware of the litigation. I don't know all the details of it. What I relied on is the knowledge that whatever those issues may in fact have been, we see a preoccupation with envy. For example, her becoming upset that Dan was taking Linda to the Blackstone Ball instead of her. That was nearly 2 years after the separation. Regardless of what's resolved about the property, that's still an indication of envy, or her anger at
Well,
Dan and
first
Linda
of all,
for getting married
Can you show
the
me
same
that?
month Dan had. And what's that? That doesn't have anything to do with what's resolved or not. For her to get angry that they chose the same month to marry in, April, that's envy. And there's a litany of these things. Even getting upset that Dan and Linda would so much as consider having children together. That's not about whether the litigation of the property was over.
Isn't that also normal things that happen to people, that when you plan to have a 20-year anniversary, where you plan to have a trip on that, and the person gets married almost the same weekend 20 years later? That's also can be hurtful, can it not, to somebody?
You bet. All of these sorts of things can cause pain, can cause upset, but she over-responds. She doesn't just get upset or shed a tear and go back to life. She stays on this campaign of revenge, intimidation, harassment up till the day she kills them.
Well,
That's not normal.
okay. And you're saying that that there was no stress involved in the litigation that was going on.
Of course it was stressful. It always is.
Okay. And will the stress of the litigation affect how somebody looks at it?
Objection, that's beyond what he's testified to as well.
Rose, you can answer that.
Stress will affect how people feel.
Of course, one of the things you have to look at is what's happening to the person. It's on an ongoing basis to find out why they may be continually upset. Do you not?
Objection, we've been over this area several times.
Just asked and answered, sustained.
You have to, in the diary, in diary number 1, did she write about the decisions that Dan was making in regards to her life, and he was making all those decisions on her own?
Would you show me what you're referring to?
Yes. She talked about being upset about,
Excuse me, because I'm going to object to how you're going to read a diary entry unless Mr. Dr. Dietz relied on that particular entry.
Sustained.
well, Dr. Dietz, you went through the diary and you picked out a few passages, but you indicated that reading the whole diary gives you a flavor for this person. Is that correct?
You get a very good idea from the entire diary of what she was complaining about during the time she made notes in the diary.
Okay.
But I only relied on portions of the diary that I thought showed something specifically relevant.
Well, so that if she had diary entries that talked about things that were happening to her throughout the divorce that might have had some effect on why she might be enraged or bothered, would you consider every diary page and those effects they might have had on her?
I was aware of what she was responding to.
Okay. So those were things that you considered.
For each of the things I relied on, I was aware of what she thought was the cause, why she thought everything was someone else's fault. There's never a time that she thought anything was her fault, and so there's always something she's blaming for it, and I knew what those were.
Well, last year when the question was asked by the district attorney at the trial, do you take responsibility for what happened in the divorce? She said, I take 50%. I take half the responsibility. Did she say that?
I don't recall if she said that or not. Her diaries sure don't have her taking any responsibility for anything.
Your Honor, if he could be directed to answer the question. And,
It's just answering your question, Mr. Wood. Go ahead.
Okay.
About the diary, you switched over, you switched back. Go ahead.
Your Honor, he's volunteered a statement I would like to introduce then. Can we approach the bench, Your Honor?
Oh, do you want to show him the page of the transcript about 50/50? Sure.
No. He just made may we approach the bench, an all-inclusive statement about the diaries never showed us. I'd like to be heard.
All right.
Doctor, the page I showed you, did you consider that page?
I read it.
And did that have any significance of why she might be enraged or why she might be angry about any various items that you've mentioned out of the diary?
Sure, she indicates what she was complaining about.
Would that have anything to do with why she might be looking to see what kind of things Dan has because of problems with finances being switched?
I don't understand what you're asking about, problems with the finances being switched.
Would it show her concern? Would it have, when you talked about the area of envy and the area, other areas of narcissism, would the fact of her being overdrawn, no savings left at the time of being left, and problems with community money being spent on Linda before the divorce, did you consider that in considering the amount of reaction she had later on?
I don't know if any of those are facts. Mind you, the diaries contain Mrs. Broderick's side of a story. Sometimes I know the other side of the story. Whenever there's another living witness telling another side of the story, it seems to differ from Mrs. Broderick's, but I don't always know the other side of the story. And which things are facts and which are things she says is really for the jury to determine. I can't determine the facts that underlie some of these complaints of hers.
Did you consider those facts?
I considered her side of the story often, and where there was another living witness, the other side of the story too. But again, I don't have a way to resolve the factual questions that are for the jury.
In 85, was she talking at all about wanting an accounting of community property?
Objection, Your Honor. We've already argued about this. Let's see, you can show the page, and if you consider this a case, we can talk about it.
Is that what you want me to do? Did you, if I can show you a page, did you consider that page?
Not particularly.
Did you consider the any of the? Did you talk in the diary about problems with her house and problems about the boys being alone at home and playing with matches?
Your Honor.
Did you consider that?
She did talk about those things in her diary.
Did you consider those?
I considered those complaints, yes.
And let me show you a page and ask you if this was something that you could consider.
I'm aware of all this.
Did the, do you remember a page in the diary where she indicated that at some point in time?
Abstain objection, unless he's used it as a basis for his opinion, it's improper for counsel to do what he's doing.
Well, hear the question first. Go ahead.
Did you consider a page in the diary where she said that she was angry at some point, that her anger she thought was getting the best of her and she didn't think she should have the children at that time?
No.
I'm asking him if he
didn't consider it.
Well, I'd like to see what diary page is referring to.
If he's alluding to the fact there's a diary page that exists, we'd like to see it.
Show it to him.
Well, I'll. Maybe this would be the time to take the morning recess, Ron.
Fine. For purposes of scheduling, ladies and gentlemen, my bailiff has relayed your consensus to me, which I certainly will comply with. You have been more than patient with us. We will certainly accommodate you. We'll take our our lunch recess now until 1:30. Please remember the admonition. When we reach a convenient point with the witnesses to break between 2 and 3 o'clock, we'll take our afternoon recess at that time. And thank you for your patience with us. And this is some small way we can repay you. Have a nice lunch.
Sir, I take it when you were talking about the going through Mrs. Broderick's diary, you indicated that there was very little as far as her depression, other than you remember one thing that I mentioned, is that correct? There's something about shaking in her bed.
Oh, there are frequent mentions of one or the other of the sorts of symptoms that can occur in depression, but there is never, as I said, a pattern of multiple symptoms simultaneously and evidence of it being persistent enough to meet the criteria. But there are lots of references to one or another symptom.
You mean, so what she doesn't do is that in the DSM-3, don't they say that even people who are having a depressive episode, their descriptions will be sometimes just as simple as I just feel bad or I don't feel good, they don't explain well what they're feeling.
That's true of when patients present.
The you talked about the sense of entitlement with the in the diary. Do you have that entry in the diary? Do you have that entry in the diary, or do you just have your notes?
I just have my notes.
Okay. So you did not do a entry yourself, or you don't recall doing an entry yourself as to you didn't make a copy of that entry in the diary,
I had the complete diaries.
but you didn't make a copy. You took notes and wrote your notes down. Is that
That's right.
Okay, what are your notes say was in the diary?
I've
You actually
got,
have Vegas, what part of that?
Doc, do you know what I'm referring to? There was a list of things for Christmas that she didn't have.
I don't have that under preoccupied with feelings of envy. Is that what we're talking about, envy?
Well, it wasn't an entitlement.
Oh, entitlement, I'm sorry. Yes, I have that here.
Okay, and what was in the entry of that on the diary?
What I have in this excerpt is, and it's not the only excerpt from that period that I have here, but in that entry, what I read yesterday was Christmas 1987. My lifestyle has been trashed. No tree, no one to help carry it in, load the car, etc. No one to see it, no party, no kids, no attic, no coffee table, no country club memberships, no boat for parade of lights, no Jag, only truck, no escort, no parties, no gowns, no presents by or for me, no ski trip, no large party, no money.
Now, were you aware that some of her Christmases were alone?
Yes,
Okay. And were you aware that Christmases were an important part of her life before?
yes.
What you read to that page in, was that something that, was that the exact quotes from the page, summary of it?
That was a passage from that page, I think. There is some material that appeared between the heading Christmas 1987 and the first line that I was quoting, my lifestyle has been trashed. But I thought I had the quotation from my lifestyle has been trashed down through no money.
Now, she has also, in other years, also made lists of things that she did not, about Christmas and things she didn't have. Is that correct?
She often made lists of various things of that sort, not just at Christmas.
Yeah. Now, showing you a entry December 6th. December 6th is another list of the things that she doesn't have for Christmas. Is that correct?
I don't know what year this is. You said this was,
It's a December 6th diary entry. It's talks about some of the things about Christmas, does it not?
Want to know if you know what year it was, Mr. Irwin?
yes, it does.
Okay. Now, did you take that into consideration? As her sense of entitlement?
Well, I took this into account in looking at the evidence about Mrs. Broderick. This is not about a sense of entitlement.
Well,
The answer is no.
well, but this is also a Christmas list, isn't it?
No, this is why she's depressed. According to the top of the entry, she's saying that she's depressed because the kids are with her and because she didn't get to go to the Blackstone ball and I mean, she's got a list of the things that are depressing her.
She's talking about overwhelmingly depressed, and she has some things that she has missing.
Objection as to counsel reading this page.
Well, he mischaracterized it, Your Honor. I'd like to at least let the jury know what the truth is.
No
Objection to that.
argumentative statements that he mischaracterized it.
Sir, under overwhelmingly depressed, she had the things that were missing, and the things she had missing, the kids being there, right? It doesn't say missing, and then there's a column
It
next,
says missing, and then it says, well, maybe I did misunderstand it, but it has listed their kids here, Danny and Rhett.
yes, she's missing having the kids here. She's missing, she's saying.
Objection.
No, that's not true.
Argumentative, just ask him a question.
Okay, I'll ask you a question.
Want to
Can I ask
start?
you a question? Okay. She's talking about things that are going on in December, is that correct?
I believe she's
Around
talking
then.
about what was happening right around then.
Okay. She talks about being overwhelmingly depressed, does she not?
She doesn't talk about it, she just says overwhelmingly depressed.
Okay. And she talks about huge weight gain, doesn't fit in any clothes.
That's there.
She talks about buying things she couldn't afford, like a Christmas tree.
She says, she implies there that she couldn't afford a Christmas tree, that's right.
Okay. And she talks about problems she was having of roofs leaking, termites in the house.
Yes,
Okay, those are things that happen a lot of times when people are depressed, is that things, at least in their mind, everything seems to be going wrong, doesn't it?
happens even to people who aren't depressed, that everything sometimes seems to be going wrong.
The, and before the witness is finished, Your Honor, I would like the same courtesy of seeing all the pages he's referred to. As often.
All right there, go ahead.
Well, I mean, I'm pulling the pages out and showing them to him. I think I have the right to the same courtesy as when they asked him to refer to.
Mr. Early, this is inappropriate. If you have a question, ask him.
Doctor, could you get for me the pages you referred to in your testimony?
That's not an appropriate question, Mr. Early. It's right there. Look at them all if you want it later. Ask him questions.
Doctor, what diary did you get, the one that you referred to as Christmas 1987?
The one labeled Christmas 1987 on that page.
Okay, and was it at the beginning of that diary?
Couldn't tell you.
Can you show me the other, can you tell me the other diary entries that you've looked at that you've referred to?
May, June 1987. A letter to Mr. Ashworth in the diary that's undated, but the entry following it is 1086. An undated entry followed by one dated Easter 86. And I need clarification of whether the question is just the ones I've testified about or others that
Yes, just the ones you testified.
I may have mentioned one or two that I haven't testified about so far. I haven't, for example, testified yet about the May, June 87 entry.
And when you say May, June 87, is that the date of Is your understanding is the date of the diary or just the date of about the time of the entry?
About the time. Sometimes they're undated, and we've made the best effort to try to figure out the time period from the context.
The,
It's an entry I refer to dated January 3, 1988. I've referred to some from her book manuscript that appear both in the diary version and the later typed version. A diary entry dated December 5, 1987. A diary entry dated January 5, 1987.
Pigeons.
Rhythmless pigeons. I believe those are the only diary entries that I've referred to.
and now, you talk a little bit about accepting of responsibility. Now, does that mean acceptance of some responsibility? Does that mean that a person has to say, I was just totally wrong with no reason whatsoever? Or am I making any sense? In other words, let me give you an example. If someone comes home, has a hard day at work, yells at their child, and then says to somebody, I was mean to my child, I had a bad day at work. Is that acceptance of responsibility?
Depends on when and to whom they say it, but yes, if they say it to the relevant people on a timely basis.
Okay. Well, for instance, in the diary, I mean, all she's doing is writing, is that correct? In other words, she's writing it to herself, basically.
Well, she's writing it to herself in posterity. She began this on the recommendation of an attorney to document something for litigation.
Now, at some point in time, and also when you're documenting something for litigation, litigation is, at least your understanding, an adversary proceeding, usually.
For the parties, it is, yes.
Okay. So when somebody is documenting something as the reasons as an adversary proceeding, what they're going to be doing is looking at the things that they can use that the other person does, normally.
That's what the adversaries will do, yes.
Okay. So it wouldn't be unusual in a diary that's being kept somewhat for her to use as evidence to have a lot of listings of what she thinks somebody else might have done wrong. Since it's an adversary, that's why she's keeping it.
That's a good point.
Now, at times in the diary, as the years go along, the diaries, her writings become much bigger. 1988, 1987.
Well, it's difficult to be certain of that, but it would appear there's that trend, since she didn't always make the entries at the times they're dated, and because of the jumping around, it is hard to say, but that may be what in fact is occurring.
Now, I asked you a question about, at some point in time in the diaries, she says to herself that she needs some financial security and that she's too enraged to have the children around because she can't accept responsibility for them at that time. In other words, she recognizes her own rage and that's the cause of not having some responsibility for them. Would that be some acceptance of responsibility?
Objection, states facts, not evidence.
No,
Argument.
it's just asking a question, O'Leary. You can answer that.
Did you understand the question?
I do, yeah, I think the way you phrased the entry now, that is more accurate than the one before, and that, yes, that implies some recognition that she doesn't want to be responsible for them when she's feeling this way. And that's a responsible thing to do.
Okay, so when you made the comment that there's absolutely nothing in the diary that shows any acceptance of responsibility, this would be at least something. When she talks about that this time.
I don't know if you've seen this particular diary page that has the counsel provided.
Sure, Tom.
I don't think that this taken as a whole reflects much sense of responsibility. Basically, she's saying here that when she gets her money, she'll be willing to talk about custody. Right now, she's too angry to be around the children or accept any responsibility for them.
Well, she gives her reasons why she's angry, but she says that one of the problems right now with custody is that she's just too mad to have the children around, and she needs to relieve that anger so that she can deal with them. She gives a reason though, right?
Is that a statement or a question?
It's a question.
She gives a set of reasons. She wants money, she wants her house, she wants her car, she wants her social standing, and only then will she talk about custody. And at the moment, she's too mad to be around them.
And do you know that at that time when she was dealing with Mr. Broderick, she was at least having some problems with, she didn't have any support at that time, any court-ordered support?
Objection, unless the doctor knows what real support Mrs. Broderick was getting at that time.
Well, do you know whether there was court-ordered support? Just asking you if you know that.
No, I believe that Dan was supporting her voluntarily.
Okay. And do you know whether there was any fine system set up?
I know there came a time that there was.
And do you know whether there was any times where there was problems with, before that, no money in bank accounts?
I don't know the truth of those matters. I know what some diary entries said about it.
She was, at some point in time, there was diary entries, a number of them, about her being concerned with delays in the proceedings and problems with trying to get her life back on track and self-esteem, was there not?
Objection, Vegas, look at the time frame here.
Put a time in it, Mr. Earl.
Well, okay, we'll start with 1985. Any of the diary entries for the year 1985, were you aware of any where she was talking about the need to find out about what kind of property they had, whether she was going to have any control of it, if she was going to have any money from month to month?
Her diary,
Objection, unless the Dr. Dietz has based his opinion on this particular diary, I'm assuming that there is one.
Sustained.
Well, when you were looking to see the reasons why she might have been upset and concerned about property and what property Dan had, did you consider the diary entries that talked about problems that she was having with knowing where she stood in life?
Objection, big, yes, and answer.
Mr. Earl, you can answer that. Did you consider that option?
I considered everything and drew my conclusions based on the unreasonableness of some of this behavior, regardless of whatever the true facts may have been.
So so you've answered the first question. You considered everything in the diary. Now, did you find any diary entries that talk about problems with self-esteem, not problems of not knowing who she was or what she had in life?
Yes.
Did the, you were talking that there were some issues surrounding the children not being able to visit her when her family came from back east. You remembered one diary entry?
That's right.
Objection, I don't think that was brought out.
Overall, it was. Go ahead.
Were there, do you remember when that was?
It was in cross-examination.
No, do you remember when that was in the diary?
No, I don't.
Do you remember a diary entry in August of '86 in regards to the Fenzels?
In objection, if he wants to show him the diary page, you can look at it and see whether or not it forms the basis of his opinion, or it's impromptu.
I can
Overall, go ahead and answer the question.
remember a diary entry such as that?
Such as what?
That in August 22nd of 1986, problems with the kids, her having the kids so they could visit with relatives.
Could I see the entry, please?
It's not something that you remember?
Not the way you've just described it. Right.
Do you remember a diary entry shortly after that where the Rogers family was at the beach and the kids couldn't visit at all?
I don't know.
You don't remember that?
No, I remember complaints about where the kids would be. There are many complaints about who had the kids and when, but I don't recall that specifically.
Just refresh your memory.
Yes, this one I don't know what to make of. It just says kids couldn't visit or call. I don't know where they were at the beach, whether that's because there's no phone or they were too far away to visit. I don't know what to make of that.
The do you remember an entry of when her three brothers were visiting in LA and custody was refused?
And had custody of what?
And custody was refused.
We have a short time frame here.
Is there a date on there, Mr. Irving?
It's 1986.
Thank you.
Not specifically, no. Yes, I recall this. See, but for me, the relevance of these has to do with the fact that she would continuously complain about not having the kids when she wanted them, but sabotaged every effort that anyone made to provide her with the children.
Sir, all I asked you is, did you see this? Did you see this entry?
Sure, but I didn't rely on it for anything more than the point I just made. She complains about the things she brings about.
And there were, when you go through the diary, the kids were still going to her for the things you would normally go to a mother for, like when they got hit by cars, bit by dogs, when they were left alone, when there was no babysitters, when they were scared, when they thought people were breaking into the house.
Objection to the question, unless he's going to refer to another diary page or some other piece of evidence that Dr. Dietz considered vital.
Based on relevancy, based on the relevancy of that, any diagnosis you given so far, Mr. Lee, maybe you can develop her.
Well, when you're talking about her entanglement, or at least her going over to the home, calling the home, finding out what Dan and Linda are spending money on, there's times in the diary where she talks about the fact that they're spending a lot of money, but their children don't have holes in their shoes. Their kids aren't taken to doctors. There's other problems that she's talking about in the diary, isn't she?
Again, let's see the diary page.
I'll show them all the diary pages, Your Honor.
All right, go ahead. It's not necessary as far as I'm concerned, if you can answer the question without looking at it.
Can you answer the question?
As soon as I understand it, I probably can. What was this one?
When we're talking about Elizabeth Broderick's, when you're talking about her moods and how she reacts to what's going on at Dan and Linda's house, what they're spending money on, did you take into consideration and that what she was getting from that house and the things she was hearing and the things she was having to do?
I took into account what she said was going on.
And in the diary, she would make entries on some days, at least as to calls, things that she was seeing.
Yes.
The now, when we talked about the histrionic personality disorder, there was times that when you would look at the diary, where in one entry she would have somebody talking very nice about them. Another time she might look at them in a light where they looking at their negative qualities. Is that?
I have pointed out examples of that. I don't recall for what I used them as examples of. I think I mentioned some times she did that as illustrations of her splitting or her black and white view of things. Sometimes as evidence of the shallow emotions of the histrionic, because the same behaviors can illustrate multiple features.
And that's also true that they see things with their emotion. In other words, if something is happening surrounding that person that is negative to them, they will see them in all negative light. If there's something good happening, they might see them in all positive light. They go to extremes.
There is that tendency to have extremes of emotion.
Okay, so when you read a page on a diary that talks about somebody, there may be something that have happened just at that time that makes it so that they'll see that their writing will reflect that emotion at the time.
That's right, and that often happens with her, that she'll get a phone call and then she'll write about being overwhelmingly depressed. And the next entry is fine.
The, there were times that, that she wrote in her diaries where it appeared that she tried to be like Dan Broderick by writing lots of legal terms in bold strokes. Isn't that true?
There are instances of that, yes.
Okay. And obviously, can that have something to do with her self-esteem or wanting to appear as powerful as she views Dan Broderick?
Or to fight back in kind.
You indicated that when she was not the center of attention, that she was brokenhearted over not being able to be a socialite.
Objection, mistakes, yeah.
Same.
Well, did you say anything about her not being able to have the role of a socialite?
I think that's a role that she felt the loss of, yes.
You indicate that there's also some shifts in attention that she has.
I don't recognize what you're referring to.
Okay. Were there times where she would go from one area and jump to another area that you saw?
In her diary?
Or in any of the things that you saw about her? When you were talking about the 8 categories of histrionic personality, did you talk about shifts in attention at all? You can recall.
I'm not sure what you're referring to. I talked about shifts in her emotions.
Okay. And how does that work, the shifts in emotions? Is that from just going from a very happy to sad or mad to something else? So is the kind of emotions you're talking about?
The examples that I referred to on direct were her things like disowning Kim. On the occasion when Kim was eager to show her new apartment, and they had a plan, and Kim was going to visit the apartment, everything seemed to be fine. And then suddenly Kim gets a phone call from her mother after she's expected her, saying, "I suddenly remembered what a traitor you are, and I won't have anything to do with you." And mother wouldn't visit. That's a shift in emotion, and a rather dramatic one.
So when you did read the testimony from the trial, you read some of the witnesses' testimony, is that correct?
The ones that listed earlier, yes.
You went through Dr. Dess's letter, and you indicated things such as after, one of the examples you gave is after 17 years, Dan never took him on a vacation. Remember the part you read from the letter?
Yes, I do remember that.
Okay. You understand that they were married for 17 years?
Yes.
Okay.
Objection.
Well, overall, the answer is yeah. Go ahead.
The, were you aware that there was a number of times when they went on family vacations that it was not Dan's habit to go on family vacations?
Well, I knew he took them on ski trips as a family every year, and that he took them on a family trip to a dude ranch in Santa Barbara. Those were family vacations.
Okay. But you understand when they went summer, when they went camping and other things, you know Dan likes to ski, don't you? Did you know that?
I knew that he did, yes.
Did you know what he felt about camping, going on a car trip?
No.
During the time that, now going through the diary, did she talk about having being in a panic over things that were happening to her in 1986 about leases, credit cards, money market funds, not having access to money.
She was complaining about money every year.
Did she talk about severe tension headaches?
She talked about headaches, many other bodily complaints, on and off.
Okay, in the diaries?
Yes, it didn't have to be very much for her to put it in the diary.
Well, for instance, how would you know that this wouldn't have to be very much for it to be in a diary? It says severe tension headache. Is there something there that tells you that that is not a severe tension headache?
Not from that page, but there are other pages where she has a list of symptoms that are very clear. I think anyone medically trained would recognize that this is hypochondriacal complaining, because she talks about very minor sorts of things some of the time. That doesn't mean that she didn't have a bad headache this day.
So you're saying that sometimes in there she complained about things that weren't as serious?
That's right. Her threshold for putting a complaint in the diary does not appear to have been very high.
Did she talk about, being awake and crying all night?
There were days that she did.
Okay.
I think there were even a time or two when she had it for 2 days in a row of having trouble sleeping 2 days in a row. Not crying all night 2 days in a row.
Did she talk about being fired from work because of attorney appointments and problems and being nervous about that?
That's what she said happened, yes.
Did she talk about her being sick, feeling sick because she misses the children?
There were times she said that.
Did she talk about day before court appearances, shaking, sick to stomach, scared of what is happening in court?
He's gonna read through the diaries unless Dr. Dietz bases his opinion on it.
Well, Dr. Dietz, you said that you went through the diary looking for some signs of whether she was any signs of depression or illness. Those physical symptoms can be symptoms of depression, can't they? Scared, shaking, crying, feeling sick.
Not unless the person has the depressive syndrome at that time. The rest of that particular entry made me think that this was histrionic, because as I recall, that's a diary entry that goes on to say that she's completely unprepared because she has no lawyer. She'd already gotten rid of lawyers by that time, and she was very prepared.
Well, this is July 16th, 1986. Were you aware that Mr. Jaffe had never been paid the money he requested?
Objection, irrelevant.
Sustained.
What lawyer did you know that she had fired by July 16th, 1986?
That was Mr. Jaffe for one, but this statement, I don't think he made that statement.
Sustained.
What lawyer had she gotten rid of by July 16th, 1986?
I think Mr. Jaffe.
And it was your understanding that that Mr. Jaffe never tried to get the money from her.
Objection, irrelevant.
Sustained.
Did she talk about that when she received some papers from Mr. Ashworth that she would get so upset that she would quit, shaking, bed feels like an earthquake?
Same objection as well.
Asked and answered.
Did she talk about, for a period of time, that she couldn't sleep, felt like she was getting ulcers?
She wrote that, yes.
she talk about getting headaches and the kids giving up on asking to see her? Talking about breaking her heart?
I don't recall that passage. This portion doesn't say what she's referring to. The preceding page may have the rest of the passage.
You have just their headaches and giving up asking to see. Is that correct?
Right.
You don't remember this page at all?
No.
Did she talk about before seeing her attorney, sometimes she would be up all night worrying? She was afraid she was losing control over her case and what was going on.
Yes, that's right.
Did she talk about not sleeping for a week because being worried about what was going to happen in court?
She said that at one point, which I thought was another example of histrionic exaggeration. It's not biologically possible to go without sleep for a week.
Did she talk about that she, you remember her talking about July 8th, 87, she couldn't sleep, scared of being alone?
There was an occasion when she said that. I don't recall when it was.
Yeah, the council going to continue to read these entries unless it's going to relate to some portion of Dr. Dietz's opinion. It's irrelevant.
Sustained.
I'd ask the court to order counsel.
Or that's another question.
Sir, when you said there was very little in her diary entries that would talk about being depressed, did you consider
Objection, that misstates the evidence. He didn't say that.
Sustained.
well, it's not your opinion that going through the diaries that there's not very much about her being, there's not very much evidence about her depression in there?
No, that's not my opinion.
The did you consider this page in the diary when you were looking at her depression?
Yes, I considered this page.
The she talks about being upset about not seeing her kids, does she not?
She says, I'm sick, I miss my kids terribly, and then has a Mr. Yuck face she drew.
Now, sometimes at least some losses can precipitate some depression, can it not? Or the feeling of loss?
Any loss can precipitate a depression or a state of sadness. The question has to do with how long one stays sad and sleepless and gaining weight or losing weight and losing interest in this whole cluster of symptoms. What I've said is that the evidence in her entire history doesn't support her having had a major depressive episode. Yet there have been many times she's been depressed, angry, moody, in response to all manner of things.
There were times when she talked about her anxiety level and depressive level being very up or very down, and feeling about that in the middle of the night, didn't she?
Objection asked and answered.
Sustained.
The talking about being afraid about being alone, afraid of people, is that a sign of depression?
Being alone and being afraid of people?
Yeah, being afraid to be alone, and because you're afraid of people that just may come to your house.
That could be an indication of a borderline trait. It could be an indication of feeling anxious. It could be paranoid. It could be depressed. It could be somebody who's feeling insecure that evening.
Okay.
It doesn't have to be pathological.
Now, some days she talked about just not sleeping or reading papers or opening mail or returning calls for days at a time, did she not?
There were days she wouldn't open the mail, especially legal mail.
And she wasn't returning calls?
Right.
Now, again, it's hard to track day to day and week to week because her diary entries may be 2 in a row and then there may be not anything for 3 or 4 weeks. Is that right?
Objection asked and answered.
Sustained.
Did she have a diary entry about problems not only with her personality, her pocketbook, and self-esteem, but just drying up her creative juices, not caring about entertaining, decorating foods, talking about now only being depressed?
That's one where she says that she used to be so good at those things, a bunch of O's in the so, and now doesn't want to decorate.
Yes.
Yeah, I think the way it was phrased there shows more than just feelings of sadness. I don't recall all the language.
Well, would you like to read it?
Thank you. I have. Thank you.
Now, she does talk in the passage about the things that she used to be good at and no longer does. Is that correct?
The thing she used to be creative at and isn't doing now.
Okay, and she indicates, now I'm only depressed.
Right.
Okay.
She's not throwing parties, entertaining.
Now, that's one of the things in at least some sign of depression, that people lose interest in things that they used to have an interest in before.
It can be, but it could also be that the circumstances changed for her so that she didn't have the same occasion to decorate or cook or entertain.
The I have no further questions.
Redirect.
No questions, Your Honor.
Dr. Beers accused.
Okay.
Mr. Early, an objection?
No, Your Honor.
Thank you very much, Dr.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Call your next witness.
Your Honor, at this point, I wanted to ask to have Mark as people's next in order.
Cassette tape.
Cassette tape, yes.
Mark tape 115. Do you have a transcript?
Yes, I do.
Mark one copy of the transcript 115A. Is this, well, before we pass those out, is this the, make sure I'm thinking about the right one. This one, there's going to be a stipulation as to the foundation.
Yes, there's a stipulation that this is a tape of Elizabeth Broderick in a conversation with her son, Rat.
So stipulate,
Yes, Your Honor.
set the stipulation. All right, pass out. Before you start, both counsel stipulate my recorder does not have to transcribe the tape. I have to take this down.
Do it.
Mr. Early?
Yes.
All right. Go ahead.
No, not coming here for the exchange? No. Why not? No. He just said no. What are you gonna do over there? No. What's the matter? Her stomach. Well, I'm gonna make a wonderful, wonderful Thanksgiving dinner with all my wonderful food, and the Borsons are coming, and the McKelsons are coming, and the Sarrises are coming. We're all gonna have a wonderful time, and you guys need to be here. You don't belong in the. And your father and his drunken, divorced friends, like last year. Remember last year, the said your father had. Yeah. She was right. But he's a rich, and she's too smart to walk out on him. Well, where's Lily? Is she still there, or she go away? What? Is Lily still in the room you're in, or she go away? No way. Poor little Muffy, I put her out back to get some exercise in the sunshine, and she's crying at the back door. She wants her babies back. There's 3 babies left now. What? Only 3 babies left. Oh, oh, they drink milk out of a bowl. If you put a bowl of milk down, they go. I haven't given them any food yet, but they're kind of cute. And they haven't got fluffy yet. You know how they get fluffy, like when you got yours, she was fluffy.
Yeah. You don't have to give any away now. I have to get up. We're giving one away. We're giving one away already. To that girl that was at your meeting.
We're giving 3 away.
Mom,
I can't keep them. Nobody's here to play with them. They poop all over them.
can we keep one?
We were going to keep the run, but it died.
Can we keep another one?
No, we're gonna do puppies again and get them again. No, the lady who was at the meeting gets 1.
Let's
The girl
stop
who
it for a
does my
second.
nails gets 1. And Canon Christophers is getting the little boy 1.
On the record, or?
Yes, Ron.
You and I have Topsy and nothing. We have our dog puppies, but that.
No, I want a baby.
You had a baby, Bucky.
The cute baby.
Muffy was a cute baby.
No, I want to raise another.
Over here, and you missed her growing up because Daddy's such a right?
Alright.
So why give you another baby and then you miss growing up again? Brett, I hate to tell you this, but you gotta learn to stick up for yourself, and you gotta speak up to Daddy. He's killing you all. He's ruining your lives and killing you, and you've got to speak up and fight back.
I'm not dead.
Yeah, well, maybe you're not dead physically, but emotionally you're dead. You don't have anyone that loves you or cares about you over there, and he mistreats you, treats you like a little piece of shit. And he's a cold-hearted. What kind of a parent is that?
A cold one.
Bad one. Very, 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 very bad one. And you shouldn't put up with it anymore. You should tell them to, and Lily and Danny should say, and come over here. Tell them to drop dead and go away. And then you'd be happy over here. Guys, stick up to him. He's a maniac. He is a raving mental maniac.
That's why we don't want to stick up to him.
Just get away. Just get over here.
Oh, God.
I'll get the police to beat the shit out of him.
Do it.
What?
Do it.
Well, first you gotta get over here. I can't just send the police over there.
Why?
Because he's not doing anything wrong over there. But if you can't tell the judges and the police that you want to be here, and you get here, then he's got a leg to stand on. Not a leg to stand on.
Only his good court.
What?
He can't good court. Cut.
What?
You'll never bring some.
No. I'll see you.
Okay.
Well, what will you tell him?
But I'm not around with that.
Okay. Maybe I'll come over and I'll bring the TV cameras and the police with me today. Would you want me to do that?
Yeah.
Would you?
Yeah.
I would like to do it too.
If I can't do.
Ask Lily if she wants me to do it. Come rescue her today. This is like getting the hostages out of Lebanon. The Iranian hostages have to do a sneak attack.
Who are Iranians?
People from Iran.
So,
They're always making war on everybody and being jerks. And they take people hostage and won't let them go. And that's Daddy has you guys hostage. He has you hostage, little prisoners. They won't let you go. You're prisoners of war. Poor babies. Could you call Danny and talk to me?
what?
Is Danny anywhere where you see him?
No.
Or hear him or anybody?
No.
Where'd he go?
I don't know.
I just heard a little boy's voice. Maybe it's Danny. Maybe he's over here.
No.
Say, Mom.
Sounds like
Sounds like he's coming up the private road. Wouldn't that be a surprise if he came here?
yeah.
That was a surprise that day you came here, remember?
What's
From the beach?
yeah.
I hear kids down on the beach playing.
You heard kids down the beach playing.
What, honey?
Did you hear people at the beach playing?
Yeah, I hear them yelling. And I hear the waves crashing. And I hear Muffy going, she wants a baby. What? When are you going to get over here?
Don't know.
When he tells you you can't come for Thanksgiving, don't you say anything back? Or you just say, oh. Uh-oh, Muffy, stop it! Muffy, stop!
What's she doing?
You're waiting here for the baby. Well, go fight, beat up Daddy.
What? Mom? Mom?
Have a short witness?
Well, Your Honor, I would anticipate my portion of the witness to take about 15 minutes. I don't know how long class would take.
Is Mr. Roy?
It's fine.
All right. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we'll take our weekend Thanksgiving recess at this time. Please remember the admonition not to discuss the case among yourselves nor allow anyone else to discuss it with you, nor form any opinions until it's finally submitted to you. Have a very nice Thanksgiving weekend. See you Monday at 9 o'clock. Members of the jury panel are present. All counsel are present. Mrs. Broderick is present. As I stated to you last Monday, ladies and gentlemen, at this time, we're going to have the closing statements of the attorneys. The district attorney goes first because the district attorney has the burden of proof. Once they've given their closing statement to you, the defense has an opportunity to give a rebuttal argument. At the completion of their rebuttal argument, the people get one final opportunity to rebut whatever is said by the defense attorney. At the conclusion of that, I'll be giving you instructions as to the law that applies in this case. You'll then retire to deliberate.
Your Honor, I believe that we agreed to one more stipulation.
All right, go ahead.
Your Honor, the stipulation would be that during the last trial of Elizabeth Fodder during 1990, defendant testified the week of October 30th, 1990 through November 2nd, 1990. After each day of testimony, it would take approximately 45 minutes to bring the defendant to the first floor holding tank of the Superior Court. She would stay there waiting for the Las Colinas transportation bus at the end of the court day, which transported all female prisoners back to Las Colinas. The court recessed on 10/30/90 at 4:30 p.m., on 10/31/90 at 4:23 p.m., on 11/1/90 at 4:25 p.m., and 11/2/90 at 12:03 p.m.
So stipulate?
Yes, Your Honor.
Accept the stipulation. May I proceed, Ms. Wells?
Thank you.
Morning, ladies and gentlemen.
Morning.
I wanted to start off by thanking all of you for being jurors in this case, which has unquestionably taken a significant sacrifice out of your personal lives to be here and to be involved in this process, which has been a long process. We could not have the best system of justice in this world if we didn't have citizens like you who were willing to give us your time and effort. And I think that you all ought to be, frankly, proud of yourself for being here and know that we appreciate your efforts. You all have a job to do now, or at least you will when we stop talking at you. It is obviously a very important job. It is important to the defendant. It's important to the victims, in this case, to their families and to their friends. It's important to this community. It is also a very specific job. Your job is to decide the legal culpability of Elizabeth Broderick's conduct on November the 5th, 1989, and that's it. There has been a lot of evidence that you've heard about all sorts of things that I told you were going to hear about during opening statements, and that frankly the defense would like you to get very distracted with. But you have the obligation to focus on the reason that you're here. You are not here to pass moral judgments on the people that are involved. You are not here to be psychologists and decide what made Elizabeth Broderick the person that she is, or what makes her the person that she is, or why Elizabeth Broderick committed these murders. The question for you is simply, did Elizabeth Broderick commit these murders? And the answer to that question, based on everything that you've heard from no matter what the source, is absolutely yes. Elizabeth Broderick took a loaded gun and blew 2 people away who were lying helpless in their sleep. And having a system of laws that prides ourselves in applying to everyone across the board isn't going to mean a heck of a lot unless she's held responsible for that. What's important for all of you to realize, and I don't mean to insult your intelligence by saying this, but people always have reasons for committing crimes. Always. They never just happen out of the blue. Nobody kills somebody else because they're ecstatically happy and everything is going wonderfully in their life. It doesn't happen that way. It's a given in any murder that there's a reason, that there's a history, that there's a background, that there's anger, that things are not going the way they want them to. That's when murders occur. Our society, and by the way, don't think for a minute that our system of law is not a compassionate system. We have the most compassionate system in the world. And when it comes time to deciding what should happen to someone who's been convicted of a crime, there is every opportunity for that compassion to click in if it's appropriate. But that doesn't mean that we don't demand, and we haven't always demanded, that people be held legally responsible for their actions. Because the fact of the matter is, there are lots and lots and lots of people out there who are angry, who are depressed, who are filled with hate, and maybe justifiably so, and they don't make the choice to prey on other people to solve their problems. And that's what this case is about. No matter how you might feel emotionally about Elizabeth Broderick, for the fact that at some point along the line, her life obviously didn't turn out the way she wanted, the way she had planned, the way she felt she deserved, which is a situation that happens every day, everywhere, to many, many people. The fact of the matter is that she's the one who made the choices on how to deal with it. She's the one who chose to forego the options of making something positive out of her life and out of all of the things she had. She's the one who chose, and everyone who knew her saw this, not to build herself up, but to tear Dan and Linda Broderick down. She had the right to make those choices. People have the right to make choices, but they also have to pay the consequences for the choices they make. Before I go any further and talk about the facts of the case, the facts that prove the defendant's guilt, I want to first talk to you a little bit about the law that applies, because it's important. You are going to be hearing a whole set of instructions from the judge when we're done arguing. And listening to those for the first time, I think sometimes sounds kind of overwhelming. But it's really not as complicated as it sounds, and I'd like to try and simplify it a little bit for you. We talked a little bit about, in jury selection, about the fact that all crimes are made up of certain elements. Excuse me. I'm still fighting my cold. There's a certain act that's required, And there's a certain mental state that's also required. Basically 2 elements in any crime. And theft is a good example we talked about. If someone takes someone else's property, they've committed the act. Not necessarily a crime if they thought it was theirs. But if they knew it wasn't theirs, if they knew they didn't have a right to it, if they intended to keep it, then they've committed a theft. And as far as the specific issue for jurors to decide, it doesn't matter what their reasons were for committing it. It doesn't matter whether they were stealing because they were greedy or they were stealing because they wanted to put food on the table for their children. The fact of the matter is they stole. And under the law, that's a crime. And under the law, that's what jurors decide. Now, you might think that the crime of murder, because it's obviously a serious, maybe the most serious crime, would have all sorts of complex elements, but it doesn't. The crime of murder is actually very similar to the crime of theft. It has only 3 elements. The unlawful killing of a human being with malice aforethought. Basically, those first 2 elements are the act, the unlawful killing of a human being. The second element, malice aforethought, is the mental state. Most cases have certain things that are an issue and certain things that aren't. There is no issue with respect to the first 2 elements of this crime here, the unlawful killing of 2 people. Not in this case. There's no question that Elizabeth Broderick is the one who broke into Dan and Linda Broderick's home and took a loaded gun, and with that loaded gun and with her own hands, shot and killed them. This is not what you might call a whodunit case. The only issue that she's denying, because it's the only one she can, is with respect to that third element, the mental element, malice aforethought. Well, what do we mean by malice aforethought? Aforethought is real easy. It just means before rather than after. There's no big deal about that, and there's no issue about that. But with respect to the definition of malice, what we mean by malice, this is an area where the law may be a little different than what we think of generally in with respect to terms. We generally think of malice the way that Webster's defines it, as hatred, ill will, spite. That's what malice means. But legal malice is a term of art. It means something very specific. There are 2 kinds of malice. It can be either express or implied. And the instruction that you're going to hear says that malice is express when there is manifested an intent to kill. And what that means is, if someone kills someone else and the circumstances are such that it's clear that they wanted to kill them, then they're acting with express malice. Killing someone with the intent to kill. It's like stealing something with the intent to steal. And absent some specific defense, such as self-defense, that justifies that killing, that's acting with express malice, and that's murder. There's no requirement that you actually hated the person that you killed or feel any particular way about them. The instruction that you'll hear says, the mental state constituting malice aforethought does not necessarily require any ill will or hatred of the person killed. An example of that might be, for example, a mercy killing. Obviously not at issue at this case. In this state, people don't have the right to make those kinds of choices for other people. And if they kill someone under those circumstances, it's killing with legal malice, and it's against the law, it's murder. There is also another type of malice, and that's implied malice. There are some circumstances under the law where the law says we're going to hold someone responsible for murder, even if they didn't actually intend to kill. And that's what we call implied malice. The instruction reads, malice is implied when the killing resulted from an intentional act, The natural consequences of the act are dangerous to human life, and the act was deliberately performed with knowledge of the danger to and with conscious disregard for human life. What does that mean? For example, if you have a bunch of men, young men, driving around in a car, and one of them has a gun, and to show all the other ones how macho he is or how brave he is, he takes that gun and he shoots into the window of a house as they drive by shooting. Unfortunately, if there's a woman in that house who's sitting there watching TV and she's hit by that bullet and killed, that young man is guilty of murder. He's acting with implied malice, even though he didn't know that woman from Adam, even though he didn't know for sure there was anybody inside that house, even though he specifically did not intend to kill anybody. He may feel tremendously remorseful after having done that. Under those circumstances, the law is going to imply malice because he certainly knew that it was likely someone would be in that house. Houses are filled with people, and shooting a bullet in there was dangerous, and he went ahead and did it anyway. That's implied malice. That's murder. Another example, based on an actual case, I think we talked a little bit about this in voir dire, is the young woman who decided to stand on the freeway overpass and throw bricks down on the cars passing by. She didn't want to kill anyone. She just wanted to scare people. She wanted to create a commotion. She wanted to get some attention. Actually, as it turned out, she was depressed. Well, one of those bricks plunged into the windshield of a car and hit a man, and it caused an accident and killed 2 people. She was guilty of murder. That's implied malice. You cannot do dangerous things like that and expect to not be held responsible when a likely result occurs. What kind of malice do we have in this case? There is no question that Elizabeth Broderick killed Dan and Linda Broderick with express malice. There was manifested, absolutely manifested, an intent to kill them at the time she unloaded that gun into their bodies. And we're not talking right now about premeditation or what she was thinking about before or what degree of murder this is. The question with respect to simply the crime of murder deals with what her intent was at the time she actually fired that gun. And ladies and gentlemen, you do not point a .38 caliber gun that you know is loaded with hollow point bullets at 2 people who are only inches away from you and start shooting unless you intend to kill them. This is not a water pistol, and she knew it. She was not shooting blanks, and she knew it. She was not aiming up into the air to scare them. She intentionally fired that gun at 2 people. And it doesn't matter what she was thinking about at any time before or at any time after. At the time she shot them, she had made the choice to shoot them. Even their own witness, the defense witness, Manny Lopez, the officer from the Border Patrol Task Force, he said that there's no question when you get to the point of pointing a gun at somebody and shooting, you are intending to, and his quote was, eliminate the target. No one but Elizabeth Broderick caused that gun to be pointed at their bodies. No one but Elizabeth Broderick caused that trigger to be pulled, and pulled again, and pulled again, and pulled again, and pulled again. At that point, no matter what else she was thinking, she was intending to eliminate her targets, and her targets were Dan and Linda Broderick. No matter what else she wants to say to you now about what happened in that room that morning and what and why her reactions were what they were, the cold, hard facts of what actually happened in the room are indisputable. There is no getting around them. And there is no getting around the fact that that first shot into Linda was right through her chest as she lay flat on her back in her bed. If she had time to react at all to the defendant being in there pointing a gun at her, she sure as heck didn't have much. She was still lying there in the bed. She didn't have time to sit up. She didn't have time to dive off the bed. She didn't have time to do anything to protect herself. That gun was pointed at her heart. The trigger was pulled when it was pointed at her heart, and she could do nothing to protect her life. There is no getting around the fact that the defendant had to then change her aim, change her direction of pointing that gun in order to shoot Dan Broderick in the back. She had to shoot Linda in the bed. She had to point at Dan and shoot him in the back. If she had just closed her eyes and shot bang, 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 it would have all been in a cluster right there in the bed where Linda was lying, and the bullets weren't. There is no getting around the fact that after she shot Dan, she then shot at Linda again. There had to have been enough time for him to have rolled off the bed. There had to have been enough time for her to have rolled into the position that she was in. She had to have changed her aim again from Linda to Dan to Linda again to accomplish that last shot into the back of Linda's head. She claims, I panicked and I shot. Even their own expert, Manny Lopez, again, when he was asked the question, was this a panic shooting? He said, no, this was not a panic shooting. He's seen panic shootings. A lot of officers have seen panic shootings, and the bullets go everywhere. This was simply good shooting, good, accurate shooting. And this was shooting by someone who had experience with guns. No matter what Elizabeth Broderick wants to say to you now, we know, for example, from Steve France, who had seen her practicing shooting back in 1986 at targets, that she knew how to shoot a gun. That's what drew his attention to her, was how good she was shooting. She was putting all those bullets right into the center cluster, the bullseye. He wasn't doing that. The point is, she knew how to handle a gun. She knew what to expect from shooting a gun. She knew that there was going to be a kick, and she controlled it to affect these shots. Even though she denies it now, along with many of her denials, she has bragged in the past about being a good shot. She bragged to Gail Forbes. Gail Forbes testified years before, when they were in Berkeley and driving by a shooting range, how she bragged about being a marksman when she was in college and winning awards for that. It's interesting that Maria Peralta, the woman who testified from the jail, said the same thing, that the defendant had bragged to her about being a marksman, about winning awards in college. I don't think that Gail Forbes and Maria Peralta had ever been able to get together to get those stories straight. She was saying the same thing. The defendant says, I just barely entered the room, which we know as a matter of fact is not true. She had to have come substantially into that room in order to make those shots, in order to get that shot that went through the wall. I just barely entered the room. Linda immediately yelled, call the police. Dan moved towards the phone, and I flinched and shot. You're going to have to use your own common sense about which came first, their moving or her shooting. I submit that it's much more reasonable to assume that they didn't start moving until after she started shooting. You have to think about the circumstances there that morning. This was 5:30 in the morning on a Sunday morning. It was just barely dawn, not a heck of a lot of light. They had been out late the night before, by the testimony, having dinner, having drinks. They would have been sound asleep. Her simply walking into that room quietly, which is what she said, was not going to wake them up, was not going to wake them up to the point where Linda would have immediately yelled, call the police. People don't wake up from a dead sleep and respond instantaneously like that. She wouldn't have even had time to focus on what was going on. It just doesn't wash. Do not forget that this business about Linda yelling, "Call the police," was never testified to before by Elizabeth Broderick. And this is crucial. She had the exact same opportunity the last time she testified to describe what happened in that room. And there was not one word about anyone yelling, "Call the police." Wouldn't you think that was pretty important? I mean, that's basically why she's saying she shot them this time. Somehow she forgot to mention that last time. Somehow that's never been mentioned to anyone else during any of the interviews she's ever given about these killings, including Dr. DeFrancesco, who asked her specifically about it. The first time she ever said anything about anyone yelling, "Call the police," was when she said it to you here in this courtroom after having talked about this case for 2 years. She has embellished her story. She has tried to make it sound better because it wasn't quite good enough last time. She had to come up with something a little bit more to give her an excuse for shooting. Really, this whole issue, we'll talk about this issue, the whole issue, I submit, is really academic. Even if Linda had yelled, "Call the police," even if Dan did roll and try to reach for the phone, even assuming that's true, how does that in any way excuse her conduct in shooting them? What did she expect them to do? I mean, when they're awakened in the dark to see that someone has broken into their home and is standing over them pointing a gun at them, what does she expect them to do? That's like a robber who goes up and puts a gun in somebody's face and says, "Give me your money," and the victim yells, "Help," and he shoots and kills them. And then he says, "But gosh, it wasn't my fault. They yelled help." Is that what she's saying? It's not my fault I shot them? When they saw me pointing a gun at them, they tried to run for cover and yell help? How does that excuse her conduct? Even if they did move in response to seeing her there in the room, what did they do? The only thing they did was move away from her to try to get cover, help. There was no lunging at her. There was no throwing anything at her. There was no grabbing any weapons. There was no threatening to hurt her. Nothing. Even assuming the truth of her testimony, they tried to get away and she shot them in the back. That is murder. What about the rest of her story about what happened that morning? She says she was just going to confront them. I was just going to have it out with them, and if they weren't going to give me the kids, I was going to kill myself. Well, first of all, there is no way that she had any real expectation of truly having some fruitful conversation with Dan Broderick that morning. I mean, think about that. She knew he wasn't going to talk to her under those circumstances. She knew, it's undisputed, that he hadn't wanted to talk to her under normal circumstances for years, let alone being awakened at 5:30 in the morning in bed with his wife, with her standing over him pointing a gun. No way. If she really wanted to confront them, that's what she says, why didn't she confront them? This woman knows how to confront when she wants to, ladies and gentlemen. She has done it many times before, and the threat of him calling the police never stopped her before. Her own testimony about the last alleged confrontation that they had, which was way back in 1988, a whole year before, she described an incident where she went over to the house to talk to him. He was out in the front, he was gardening. He told her to leave or I'm going to call the police. And she said, "Go ahead, I'm not leaving." She basically called his bluff. And he backed off. He didn't call the police. He said, "Okay." Nothing happened. She wasn't arrested. That was the last experience she'd had with him in that regard. Why was there some reason to expect anything different this time? Especially given the fact that she's got a gun this time. She's the one who unquestionably had control over that confrontation. Why did she sneak into the back room of that bedroom? That was never explained by her. She claimed she went into the back door of the house because she didn't want to give them a chance to hear her coming and call the police, because she wanted to have this confrontation. But she never explained why she went this circuitous route to get into that bedroom, why she went down the hallway and through the TV room and in that back door. If she wanted to confront them, once she got into the house, once she got up to the top of the stairs, there's the door to the bedroom, why didn't she walk into the bedroom and confront them? That's what somebody bent on a confrontation would do. And even if they did move, she's got the gun. All she has to do is say, hold it, don't move, we're gonna talk. She said she brought the gun for a show of force, to make them listen to her, do what she wanted. Well, why didn't she use it for a show of force then? If she had truly wanted a confrontation, she would have had it. She didn't. If she had truly wanted to commit suicide when she didn't get what she wanted, she would have. She didn't. If they were diving for the phone and yelling, call the police, they obviously were not in a listening or negotiating posture, and she knew that, but that gun never got pointed at her. It only got pointed at them, and it got pointed at them immediately. The truth is, she never intended to commit suicide that morning. Maybe she's threatened that before in the past, but somehow it never happens. And it certainly wasn't going to happen then. She said that morning to Kim, that morning when she called and talked to Kim in Arizona, she said, it was either him or me, and I couldn't let him win. That's a pretty definite statement of intending to kill someone. I couldn't let him win. If she had killed herself, he would have won. Dan and Linda would have won. They would have had themselves. They would have had their happiness. They would have had their kids. They wouldn't have her around bugging them anymore. And they'd be able to say, see, she was crazy, which the thought of drove her extremely angry. She hated the thought of them calling her crazy. There was no way she was going to give them the satisfaction of that. And she even specifically said that. She told Amy Wallace, a reporter. She wrote in her book. She wrote in her letters. She had sworn to herself she would never give them that satisfaction. No matter how much talk there is about her being depressed over this period of time, which I don't really think there's any dispute about, the fact is that there is no evidence, none, all the way from 1985 to 1989, that she ever made any attempt to commit suicide or even a gesture. Never. There is no evidence that she ever wrote anything, and she does a lot of writing about wanting to kill herself. She never wrote anything about it. She never told anyone, I'm so unhappy, I want to kill myself. What she said over and over and over was, I'm so unhappy, I want to kill Dan and Linda because they're the ones that made me this way. If by some chance there might be some tiny speck of doubt about what her intent was when she shot them that morning, That speck has got to completely disappear when you look at what she did immediately after shooting them. After she unloaded the gun, she knew exactly what she'd done. And whether you believe the testimony that she gave at the trial last time, that she heard all 5 shots, which is what she testified to, I heard the 5 shots and she banged them out, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Whether you believe that testimony or whether you believe her testimony here in this courtroom that I just heard one big explosion, the fact of the matter is she knew she'd fired her gun and she knew she'd fired it at them. She saw Dan had fallen off the bed. She saw that Linda was obviously motionless on the bed. She even said to Lee that morning that she heard Dan say to her, "Okay, you shot me, I'm dead." If she hadn't hit them, they would have unquestionably been still moving. They would have been yelling. If Linda before had been yelling, "Call the police," after she'd shot those bullets, she would have been yelling. If she didn't have a bullet through her brain. Elizabeth Broderick didn't panic and run out of that room. She didn't go, "Oh my God, what have I done?" and rush over them to see if they were okay. She walked around the bed and pulled the phone out of the wall. Actually, what appears to have happened is that she walked around the bed either to make sure that she had shot Dan or to maybe say some final word to him. And that's when she saw him reaching for the phone, when he was down on the ground there reaching for the phone, because that's when she took her gun and hit him over the hand as he's reaching for the phone. That's what she told Dr. DeFrancesca. She hit him over the hand. She had to come all the way around the bed and walk. There's not a whole lot of room here to negotiate. Through here, this door of the armoire is open, come all the way around here. The phone is up here on the nightstand where Dan is reaching for it. She's standing right there, hitting him over the hand when he's reaching for the phone. That's when she heard him, although she denies making the statement now to Patty Monahan, that's when she heard him gurgling in his own blood. And ladies and gentlemen, that's exactly what he would have been doing, gurgling in his own blood as she's hitting him. And when she realized that he was obviously injured, but not dead, that's when she pulled the phone out of the wall. This is not panicked conduct. This is intentional, calculated, deliberate, incredibly cold conduct. There is no question she was thinking about her goal, and she was acting to accomplish that goal. She wanted them to die. And she told Lee, her daughter, that morning. She intentionally pulled that phone out so he couldn't save himself. That is acting with express malice. It's actually pretty hard to imagine anyone acting with any more malice, either in the legal or the lay sense, than Elizabeth Broderick. The important thing to realize, or the interesting thing maybe to realize, is that even if you set aside the issue of whether or not she was acting with express malice, with the express intent to kill, even if you accept everything that she says is true, even if you don't doubt her credibility whatsoever, you buy the entire story, she has still, by her own testimony, admitted killing 2 people with implied malice. You don't have to necessarily buy the express malice. There's implied malice here without question. The fact is that she's the one, and this is undisputed, who intentionally chose to go over to their house that morning. She had lots of other choices. In fact, she testified. She'd even specifically contemplated other choices. She could have gone down to the beach to take her walk like she contemplated. She made the choice not to. She could have gone into the other room and talked to Brad Wright, who was there in her house, to talk about what was going on. She could have called her friend Ronnie Brown, who went on walks with her early in the morning lots of times, to talk about what was going on. She could have called her attorney to say, hey, what's going on here? What are we going to do about this? She chose to go over to their house seeking a confrontation. She chose, and this is undisputed, she admits, she chose to take a gun with her in order to have that confrontation. She chose, and she admits, that she knew the gun was loaded. She admits she knew she wasn't supposed to be there in their house. She had no right to be there. She was committing a crime just by breaking in there. She admits that she specifically chose to take that gun out of her car and take that loaded gun into the house and into the room to make sure that they do what she wanted them to do. Whether you believe her when she said she just wanted to confront them or not, the fact is, the undisputed facts are that they were in their own home, minding their own business, lying in their own bed, sound asleep, when she broke into their house, when she snuck into their room, and when she started shooting. They ended up dead, and she walked away. Even accepting everything she says as true, the law does not allow people to charge into other people's homes with loaded guns to confront them, catch them totally off guard, helpless and defenseless, kill them both, and then say, but gosh, I really didn't mean to. This is certainly much more egregious and intentional conduct than throwing bricks off an overpass or even doing a drive-by shooting. This is murder. What I've been talking about so far is the crime of murder, simply the crime of murder. The starting point of all murder is second-degree murder. There are only 2 degrees, first degree and second degree. If it's not first, it's second. Everything's second. If it doesn't come within one of the definitions of first-degree murder. And that's the only issue for you all in this case. Is this first-degree or second-degree murder? The law provides that there are certain types of murder that are first degree, basically based on the manner in which they're committed. And this is just a matter of law. These are just some examples. They're not all of the examples. But if you commit a murder by using a bomb, it's first degree. If you commit a murder by using armor-piercing ammunition, it's first degree. If that young man who did the drive-by shooting had used armor-piercing ammunition, everything else being the same, it's first-degree murder under the law. Lying in wait, if you use poison, if it's deliberate and premeditated, during the commission of certain crimes, robbery, burglary, rape, if a young man breaks into a house to commit a burglary, he doesn't want to kill anybody. He wants to steal a television set. But maybe he's confronted by the occupant. He's scared. There's an altercation. He pushes the man. The man falls and hits his head on a brick and dies. That's first-degree murder, even though he had no intent to kill him, as a matter of law. Elizabeth Broderick committed first-degree murder, absolutely, because under the law, this was willful, deliberate, and premeditated. I don't really think that there's too much here that you wouldn't expect on what the definitions of these things are. Willful means intentional. Deliberate means after careful thought and weighing of considerations. And premeditation means considered beforehand. It's the same thing as aforethought, before as opposed to after. The law is real clear that there is no set time that's required for a killing to be deliberate and premeditated. There's no requirement that it be thought about for 1 minute or 5 minutes or a half hour or a day or 2 weeks. The instruction that you'll hear says, the law does not undertake to measure in units of time the length of the period during which the thought must be pondered before it can ripen into an intent to kill, which is truly deliberate and premeditated. The time will vary with differing individuals and under varying circumstances. The true test is not the duration of time, but rather the extent of the reflection. A cold, calculated judgment and decision may be arrived at in a short period of time, but a mere unconsidered and rash impulse is not such deliberation and premeditation as would make the crime first-degree murder. So the question is, was this a decision based on reflection and thought, or was it a rash impulse? That's the question. Elizabeth Broderick's decision that morning was unquestionably a considered decision. She had been considering killing these two people, thinking about killing these two people, maybe not seriously, but absolutely thinking about it for years. And that's what makes it the exact opposite of a rash impulse. A rash impulse is something that happens when all of a sudden you're presented with a situation that you weren't expecting, that catches you totally off guard. You just react. You don't think about it. You don't have time to think about it. You react immediately. That's what a rash impulse is. For example, not really dealing with the facts of this case, but you might have a guy in a bar who's maybe had a few drinks, maybe had a bad day, and some other guy starts flirting with his girlfriend. And he gets angry and he tells him to cut it out. And the other guy says, pound sand, maybe calls him a couple of bad names, calls his girlfriend a couple of bad names. And the guy just explodes. And he grabs a mug of beer and he smashes him over the head and kills him. That's murder. But it's not premeditated murder. He wasn't thinking about killing that guy before he went into the bar that night. He didn't even know him. He wasn't thinking about doing it until the immediate instant that he picked up the mug and did it. What occurred here is not even close to that kind of situation. She had been doing an incredible amount of thinking about killing these two people for years, these two people who she hated so badly. These are just some of the many sorts of statements and things that she had been saying over the years. I mean, starting off with her statement to Gail Forbes way back in 1985 when they first separated, that life would be better if I just killed Dan. That was probably, back there in 1985 when they just separated, that was probably just an expression of anger and hurt and being upset. But that became a very repeated theme for her, that life would be better for her if he were dead. She said the same thing to Danny in that taped conversation that you heard. And that's a tape that you might want to listen to again. Because she tells Danny, I wish he'd just die. I wish he'd just get drunk and drive off the road. Then we'd all be happy. She couldn't be happy knowing that he was out there living his life and knowing that he was living it with someone else, with Linda. She directly admits that in one of those messages that you heard on the machine, where she says, I close my eyes and I see you and Linda doing all your wonderful things, and you're going to be so sorry. She couldn't stand the thought of them doing things together, and she was going to make them sorry. Those messages that you've heard, which, by the way, most of them had nothing to do with the children and getting in touch with the children. They're relevant not just because they show the extent of her anger towards Dan and the extent of her hate to Linda, but they give you a feel for the fact that this woman was not a passive, submissive, beaten down woman. This woman, when you listen to those messages, is absolutely in control. She's in control, she's demanding, she's angry, she's vengeful. She talks about being so upset because Dan had so much control over her. She says that a lot. Well, you've heard those messages, and again, you might want to listen to them again. You saw her testify. I submit to you that no one controls this woman. No one, not even her own attorney. She says and does what she wants when she wants. She always has, and she always will. She claims she was so afraid of Dan. I was terrorized by him, she says. If you're truly afraid of something or someone, you run the other way, you stay away, you don't continually bang them on the head. That makes no sense, and that's what she was doing. A woman who is truly afraid of what her ex-husband, for example, might do, does not intentionally aggravate him, does not intentionally taunt him, does not intentionally demand that he do things now or else, does not express glee over publicly embarrassing him, does not threaten to kill him over and over. This is not a woman who was afraid. She's the one who said, in one of those messages, she says to Dan, Lily tells me you're afraid of me. You better damn well be afraid of me. And he was afraid of her. And as it turned out, he obviously had good reason. This anger, these threats were going on nonstop. According to the testimony of her children, in 1985, in 1986, in 1987. In 1987, she's telling Ruth Roth things like, I won't be the single mother of 4 children. He'll die first. Not, I'll die if I don't get my children, but he'll die if I have to take responsibility for them so that he can go on and be happy. The primary thing going on there was not depression in the sense that she wants to have you believe, in the sense that it was somehow making her dysfunctional. The primary emotion was anger and rage. Dr. Roth said that Elizabeth Broderick was probably the angriest woman she'd ever met. And she had met and worked with thousands of people going through divorces. Many, many, many of which were in situations every bit as bad or difficult or worse than Elizabeth Broderick. This was 2 years after separation, in 1987, and she is still saying things like, and this is a quote, "That little fucker was mine, and he'll stay mine." She was still refusing to accept he wasn't hers anymore and doing everything she could to make him pay for it. That was in March of 1987 with Dr. Roth. She was still refusing to take the children in December of 1987, claiming she didn't have enough money. That was the same time when she was spending hundreds and thousands of dollars shopping at Saks and Nordstrom's and Robinson's and I. Magnin. Any mother who truly wanted her children would not let a shopping spree at Nordstrom's stand in her way. Her priorities were clear, and it was making life difficult for Dan and Linda. That was in 1987. What about 1988? That's when she's writing in her diary. There is no better reason in the world for someone to kill than to protect their home, possessions, and family from attack and destruction. You have attacked and destroyed me, my home, my possessions, and my family. You continue to repeatedly attack and steal and destroy. You are the sickest person alive. A law degree does not give you license to kill and destroy, nor does it give you immunity from punishment. No one will mourn you. This doesn't say there is no better reason in the world to hate or to be angry or to take you to the cleaners in court or to make your kids hate you or just to make your life miserable. This says there is no better reason in the world to kill. And no one will mourn you. This is a direct and specific deliberation over an act of killing. She's thinking about the reasons for doing it, and she's thinking about what she thinks the consequences are going to be. No one will mourn him. And that comment, that no one will mourn you, is interesting in the context of her anger after she kills them when she finds out that people are mourning them. Her comment to Amy Wallace, the reporter, was she was tired of hearing people mourn Dan and Linda. It always makes me mad when people call them the victims. She'd previously thought about this, and as far as she was concerned, people weren't supposed to mourn them, and they were, and she was angry about it. This claim that she was upset, that she never got to tell anyone afterwards how sorry she was, is incredible. It's a lie. Nothing prevented her from doing that. Nothing. She wrote letters to hundreds of people. She gave interviews to dozens of newspaper reporters. She probably made thousands of phone calls, and not once did she make any effort to tell anybody she was sorry. The most recent statement that she made in October of this year to People magazine was that she had no remorse. I won't accept the blame for what happened. I didn't have the affair. She is saying that to you because she's playing her audience. She's doing exactly what Dr. Dietz says she does. She plays to her audience. She knows what she has to say to get the intended result. And she's hoping that by saying that, one of you is going to feel you should excuse her for her responsibility in these acts. Don't you think the most important people in the world for her to have said anything about being sorry for these killings would have been her children? She never told Kim she was sorry for killing her father, a father that she knew Kim adored. She told Kim in that conversation from jail, I did it for you. That was basically what she said. I did it for you. He was making you so unhappy. He wasn't paying for college. Talk about laying a guilt trip on a child for the rest of her life. I killed your father for you? In late 1988, she wrote a letter to Dr. Dietz. Dr. Dietz was the psychiatrist or psychologist who testified at the divorce trial and made a recommendation that she should not have custody of the kids. And she was angry about that. And you'll see that letter. It was referred to by Dr. Dietz. It's a very interesting letter. You can feel when you read it her absolute rage and anger. And it's directed not only then at Dan, But at Dr. Dietz, because he's had the nerve to go against her, to make a recommendation against her, to suggest that at that point she was not the perfect mother, it's filled with the exaggeration and the histrionics and the anger. One of the statements that she makes in that letter, Mr. Broderick did not become what he is because he was married to a whiny weakling of a wife. He knew what I could do for him. He knew I was a better, stronger person than he. This is a quote. He picked the right girl to marry, but he picked the wrong girl to. She's gonna get him back. That's what she's saying. He picked the wrong girl to mess with. Even her own witnesses, some of the witnesses that the defense put on, Melanie Coors, who was the interior decorator that knew her, testified how angry and frustrated she was because she wanted to get him back and couldn't figure out a way to do it. Another defense witness, Vanjie Burt, the woman who testified that she hadn't seen the defendant for a while. She saw her in the summer of 1989 before these killings and described how she was still filled with hate and said, "I'll get his ass yet." Hate and revenge. In 1989, after the judgment, the divorce judgment, she wasn't just talking in generalities anymore. She wasn't just crossing pictures out of family pictures. She wasn't just defacing other pictures. She wasn't just vandalizing his property. She wasn't just writing about murder as a likely result when you don't get what you want in a divorce. She was getting much more specific. She did buy a gun in March of 1989, the month before the wedding. She's got several reasons for that now. I submit that it's interesting that there was no evidence presented, no evidence that she ever told anyone about those reasons back then when she bought the gun. She claimed something about being upset because the house had been burglarized, being upset because a boy that Kim was dating, Tom, was making threats. Interestingly enough, Kim would not have even been home at that time. She was away at school in March of '89. She didn't get back until May. Not one witness corroborated that she told them about these concerns for her personal safety to the extent that she felt she needed to buy a gun back then when she did it. In fact, Brad Wright testified that she told them she bought the gun because shooting was a hobby. Don't you think if she was concerned about her safety to the extent she felt she had to buy a gun to protect herself, that she would have told Brad Wright that? Actually, the day she bought the gun was the day that she had learned that Linda had tried to retrieve the wedding list that had been stolen, that she'd been brought back into court that day, and she was extremely angry about that and ordered to return the list. She was humiliated by the court by being ordered to return the list. And when after being angry and humiliated about what was going on and thinking about and realizing the wedding was coming up, that day she left court and she went to the gun store and she bought a gun. And that's exactly when she started telling people that she was going to use that gun to shoot Dan and Linda. She told Sylvia Cavins, one of the housekeepers, she was going to shoot him in the head at the wedding. Sylvia was concerned about that statement. It was not an idle threat like, I hate him, I want to kill him. She was concerned enough to tell Dan and Linda about it. Kim testified she threatened to kill him at the wedding all the time. She told Sylvia Cavins another time she was going to kill him, and when the jury heard her story, they'd let her off. She said the same thing to Kim and Lee. How the world would thank her if she killed Dan Broderick. That's thinking about the consequences, ladies and gentlemen, whether they're right or not, or reasonable or not, she's thinking about them. And the judge is going to tell you that a person doesn't have to meaningfully and maturely reflect about the consequences. All they have to do is think about them. And no matter what she says about those threats, she talks about like it was no big deal. They were taken very seriously. I mean, people don't go hire security guards for their wedding because some idle threats are being made. A friend does not set up a beeper system with someone else at the wedding because these are just idle little threats. She was concerned about Elizabeth Broderick's obsession over Dan and Linda and Dan and Linda getting married. She had taken the wedding list. She was obsessed about the details of the wedding. She was talking about engraving the date of the wedding on a watch that she bought. She refused to go out of town. People were definitely concerned. This woman was going to kill somebody. She says Dan wasn't even really concerned. He was just making a big deal out of it. He just was spreading rumors about me. Well, he made the very chillingly prophetic statement himself only a few months before at the divorce trial, when he said, I don't think there is any amount of money in this world that is going to be sufficient for you. You want me, you want my money, you want my death or my ruination in this community. You want me destroyed and over and done with, and unless and until that happens, you are not going to be happy. And he was right. After the wedding, she started putting the gun in her pocket when Dan would come over to pick up the boys. She admits that. Why did she do that? Not because she was afraid of Dan Broderick. I mean, all the evidence is, again, even from her, that he actively avoided her. He was afraid of her. He did everything he could to avoid contact. He would even stay out in front of the house and honk the horn so that the boys would come out so that he could avoid contact. Why is she putting that gun in her pocket? Why is she showing that gun to her son, Danny, as they're driving away and she's showing him she's got the gun? What she's hoping for is a confrontation. She's hoping he's going to do something, get angry at her, confront her, so she'll have an excuse to shoot him right then and there. And the problem was he wouldn't do it. He wouldn't confront her. He wouldn't give her the opportunity. And so she had to think of another way to do it. Over the summer and fall following the wedding, there wasn't much of an opportunity to do it. Dan and Linda first went on their honeymoon. She was gone the entire month of July to Canada. Then they went to Greece. Then she went to San Francisco. Then they went back east. Then they went to Notre Dame. Then she went to Acapulco. The weekend of November the 5th was probably the first weekend in months that both of them had been in town, and she had the children. It's also right in here during this time when she's saying things like what she said to Linda David, one of the housekeepers. I know Dan and Linda just want to be left alone, but that's not going to happen. I'm either going to make his life a living hell or I'm going to murder him. Linda David took that statement real seriously. It was very disturbing. It was not an idle threat. And right about this time, Kim's keys disappear one day when she's with her mother. A rather interesting coincidence. Also during this time, she's filed a motion for custody of the boys, and she's learned that Dan is seriously considering not fighting, giving her the boys. And that evidence is undisputed. Kathy Cafaro, his attorney's testimony is undisputed that that was his position. It's undisputed that he hadn't filed an opposition. Remember her statement to Ruth Roth? I'm not going to be the single mother of 4 kids. He'll die first. Well, she was just about to become the single mother of her kids. And deep down inside, she was just as infuriated by the thought that she'd end up being stuck taking care of these kids while he was free to go on and start a new family with Linda. She specifically complained about him starting a new family with several people. She complained about Linda leading her life, Linda being Mrs. Daniel T. Broderick, years after their separation. She complained about that to Helen Picard the day before she killed her. She told PJ Hathaway she was so angry at Dan she wanted to kill him the day before she killed him. The important thing you have to understand when you're dealing with the concept of premeditation and deliberation is that the actual decision to kill doesn't have to be made long before the actual killing. The actual decision to kill does not have to be made long before the killing. It's not my position, for example, that when she bought the gun in March of 1989, or some specific time in September or October, that she decided on November 5th, I'm going to kill him. That's not what happened. I think it's pretty clear from the evidence that she didn't firmly make that decision until that weekend. She had been thinking about it for years. She had been seriously ruminating over it ever since she bought that gun. She had been formulating real possibilities ever since she lucked onto Kim's keys. And the circumstances fell into place that weekend. It's interesting that she admitted herself when she testified that she was upset because, in her view, Dan and Linda never suffered a moment through all those years that she had suffered. Well, she decided now it was their turn to suffer. She says it herself in that letter that she writes to Kathy Cafaro sometime that weekend. She says, I am really sick of being his victim. That was always her perception. No matter what, she was the victim. What she decided was, I'm not going to be his victim anymore. I'm going to make him mine. And she was all prepared. She had the gun, she had the keys, she had the bullets, she had the kids. They were home, the time was right, and she made them her victims. When you decide this case, you need to think about the facts that can't be ignored, no matter how much rationalization is thrown at you. The fact is that that morning, Dan and Linda weren't doing anything but sleeping in their own bed, in their own house. The fact is that it was Elizabeth Broderick, and only Elizabeth Broderick, who decided to go over to their house with a loaded gun. With killing on her mind, she was going to kill somebody, and hate in her heart. That it was Elizabeth Broderick who broke into their house when she knew she had absolutely no right to be there, and had all sorts of other options that morning. That it was Elizabeth Broderick who gave them absolutely no chance to respond, to talk, to tell her they'd give her what she wanted, to protect their lives, to plead for their lives. It was Elizabeth Broderick who shot them in the back, and left them for dead. It was Elizabeth Broderick who the very next day was describing to Dr. Robinson that she was happy and relieved. It's Elizabeth Broderick who's even bragged to Maria Peralta about what a good shot she'd been when she'd shot them. Ladies and gentlemen, if that isn't murder, I don't know what is.
Thank you, Ms. Wells.
Take our morning recess at this time. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be in recess until 25 minutes to 11. Please remember the admonition.
Light at the end of the could see no light at the end of the tunnel.
An ex-wife's bitter jealousy may have exploded.
She didn't just get mad, she got revenge. Betty Broderick. She helped put her husband through college, raised their kids, ran the house. But when he left her for another woman,
I just fired the gun.
Murdered her ex and his new bride in their bed. Then she won sympathy as a woman scorned.
Why didn't you wait so long to kill her?
In this hour, the real Betty Broderick.
7 years of my life being wasted.
Was she the target of emotional abuse or a woman who just simply lost it?
If that isn't murder, I don't know what is.
This is Headliners and Legends. Hello, I'm Lester Holt. You probably know her name from the television movies, from magazine stories, or even from Betty's own appearances on talk shows. But just who is Betty Broderick? Is she a woman scorned, spoiled socialite whose jealousy turned to murder? Or was she a supermom and super wife driven to kill by an emotionally abusive husband who exchanged her for a younger woman? She is a convicted murderer that some see as a martyr. Here's a life so far behind a debate that never seems to end.
Just before dawn on Sunday, November 5th, 1989, as most of San Diego lies sleeping, Elizabeth Ann Broderick, recent divorcee and mother of 4, slips out of bed. She drives to the home of her ex-husband, prominent millionaire San Diego attorney Dan Broderick, and his wife of 7 months, Linda. With her eldest daughter's keys, she opens the back door, climbs the stairs, and enters the bedroom. In her hand is a gun. It's dark. She fires, in all, 5 times. She pulls the phone out of the wall and leaves.
An ex-wife's bitter jealousy may have exploded today.
A prominent attorney and his wife dead of gunshot wounds.
Within hours, Elizabeth Ann Broderick turns herself in. By the end of the day, 2 people are dead, and 4 children have lost their father and stepmother to death, and their mother to prison. This is a different Elizabeth Ann from the one who was born on November 7th, 1947, the third of 6 children of Marita and Frank Bisceglia of Eastchester, New York. Hers is a large Catholic Irish-Italian family, not well-to-do, but comfortable. Betty is raised to value family, education, and religion.
I was the little goody two-shoes that cleaned the principal's office. I went to Catholic schools my whole life, weirdo little uniforms.
She is groomed to graduate college, marry well, raise a good family, and contribute to society.
I would break dates with handsome, cute guys in high school and college because I'd prefer to babysit.
In 1964, she graduates from high school early and enrolls in the small Catholic College of Mount St. Vincent's in Riverdale, New York.
All of my friends are just like me, square, like 90-degree angle corners, sharp edges, squares, and we're happy that way.
In her freshman year, she meets a senior pre-med student at a football game at the University of Notre Dame in South Bend, Indiana. He asks the pretty blonde for a pen, and on a napkin writes his full name. At the end, he adds the initials MDA. He explains, Daniel T. Broderick III, medical doctor, almost.
Dan had tried to woo her, and she wasn't, for whatever reason, much impressed with him. She thought a little bit on the geekish side, but he did court her fairly hard, and then that blossomed into something.
The couple date for the next 3 years, and on April 12, 1969, at the Church of the Immaculate Conception in Tuckahoe, New York, Elizabeth Ann Bisceglia becomes Mrs. Daniel T. Broderick III in a traditional Catholic ceremony.
It seems like they're kind of marrying each other for, a dream more than love. A dream of like big house and family and cars and kids.
That dream, Betty says, turns into a nightmare as soon as the ceremony is over. Her honeymoon is spent in tears as Dan, who seems to change overnight, reads by the poolside and is cold and distant.
I believe it was her position that as soon as they were married, he began treating her like his domestic slave.
Dan isn't happy either.
He relayed the story that within weeks of his marrying Betty, he knew that he'd made a mistake. And he knew that there was something that wasn't quite right about Betty. But there were Irish Catholics, and you don't get a divorce.
Betty returns from the honeymoon pregnant and is told it is unlikely she'll be able to carry the baby to term because of a medical condition. But with Dan continuing his studies, she needs to keep her job as an elementary school teacher. On January 24th, 1970, the couple's first child, Kimberly Broderick, is born. Just 18 months later, Betty gives birth to their second daughter, Lee. Dan decides a medical degree alone will not provide the lucrative lifestyle he craves. After being accepted at Harvard Law and taking out a $20,000 loan, he moves the family to Boston, where he studies to be a malpractice attorney. Betty supplements their income, selling door-to-door, working at night, and even resorting to food stamps.
They spent their money on making sure that Nan got what he needed.
In 1972, with 2 kids under 3 and little income, Betty discovers she is pregnant again. Her pregnancies have been arduous, and she is not sure she can handle another one. But she and Dan decide to keep the baby. He is away on a ski trip when Betty prematurely goes into labor.
He spent money up skiing in Vermont while she was in the hospital having the babies, or miscarriages at times.
Their son dies just days after birth. Living near family is important to Betty, but when Dan finishes law school, they decide he should accept an offer with a law firm in San Diego. Though his first-year salary is minimal, for the Brodericks, after years of studying and paying and planning, the future has finally arrived. Coming up, success and sacrifice. The first years in San Diego are by no means easy. The young family lives in cramped quarters, and Betty Broderick still supplements their income by babysitting and holding down a nighttime hostessing job.
I believe she had an understanding that their dreams were the same. What they wanted in family and lifestyle would be something that they would achieve together.
In 1975, they buy their first house in a modest part of La Jolla, just north of San Diego, a neighborhood full of families just starting out. Betty fits right in.
There was something warm and lovely about Betty, that you wanted to be around her.
The family's comfort level increases with Dan's rising income. Betty no longer needs to work, but runs an informal daycare center out of her home for fun. But Dan works harder than ever, telling Betty he will have time for her when he attains the level of success he has always dreamed of.
Betty did complain that he was never around for the children, that she had to do everything.
By 1976, when their son Daniel is born, the family seems well ensconced in their home on Coral Reef Avenue. But the mood inside draws attention.
When I was over there and Dan came home, I would leave. There was a whole different atmosphere. He frightened me a little.
As much as she loved motherhood, Betty's pregnancies were difficult. She had several miscarriages and an abortion without Dan's knowledge.
I did hear stories from Dan that Betty became pregnant and had abortions without telling him.
On Valentine's Day, 1979, Betty gives birth to their fourth and last child, Rhett T. Broderick. At 32, after 7 pregnancies in 10 years, Betty undergoes a tubal ligation. Dan even marks the occasion.
Dan gave her a gold necklace, and it had a baby carriage, and I think it said the end.
With the childbearing years behind them, Betty and Dan decide he should start his own practice, and very quickly it pays off. By 1983, the IRS officially considers the Brodericks millionaires. But for 38-year-old Dan and 35-year-old Betty, success seems to drive them further apart.
I was a single parent the whole time because he was so busy being doctor, lawyer, Indian chief, working, and no one made him work like he did either.
Betty and Dan keep up appearances, though not exactly La Jolla socialites. They attend society balls and legal functions, she in designer wear and Dapper Dan, as he is known, in his infamous top hat. But for the Brodericks, money doesn't buy love.
Most of my early childhood memories are, at home, where pretty much, some conflict, some butting heads between my parents.
Whatever the details of the Brodericks' problems, after 13 years of marriage, they come to a head in early 1983. At a party, Betty hears Dan remark on the beauty of a new office assistant, 21-year-old Linda Kolkina. Alarm bells are set off in Betty's head. In the months that follow, Betty gets a strong sense from Dan that he no longer finds her attractive. and doesn't even love her.
I didn't care about anybody else's opinion of me. I really cared about his. He really had me believing that I was just the most wasted, ugly piece of crap.
She confronts him about an affair with Linda. She says he denies it, calling her crazy.
People knew that he'd been seeing Linda. It had been whispered about because they'd been seen around, and he wasn't home.
Mom was always crying and screaming at my dad, and my dad was just like, you're crazy, you're nuts, like you're delusional, you need to see a doctor, like, I'm not having an affair.
On her 36th birthday, in a cry for help, Betty slashes her wrists in a not very convincing suicide attempt. Dan comes home, bandages her up, and again, she says, tells her he is not having an affair.
Instead of just admitting he was having an affair and either choose her or choose me, he kept everything going for several years, and he just waged a full-on frontal attack on me. Somehow everything was my fault.
On Dan's 39th birthday, Betty decides to surprise him at his office, all dressed up bearing gifts and champagne. But Dan is not there. His office is strewn with remnants of a party, and Betty says his secretary tells her that Dan is out to lunch with Linda. Betty waits all afternoon, but Dan doesn't return.
It's obviously a very humiliating scene to go there and find out that what you thought and what you had been beating yourself up for was actually true.
His repeated denials of the affair fuel Betty's anger and desperation. She drives home, drags his clothes onto the lawn, and burns them. When Dan arrives later that night, Betty confronts him, but he still won't admit the affair. She is imagining things, he says. Finally, on February 28, 1985, 2 years after Betty first got an inkling of Linda Kokina, Dan announces he is leaving. Betty says he tells her he needs space and doesn't mention an affair, a separation, or a divorce. He leaves the next morning.
I think that provoked and made her crazy. She became absolutely possessed by this hatred and this. She couldn't move on. She couldn't accept it.
Dan is, however, paying Betty $9,000 a month for expenses. In the beginning of May, Betty is expected at a big celebration planned in New York for her father's 70th birthday. It's a grown-up affair. The kids are not part of the invitation. In what some say is a strategic move to get Dan to realize he can't live without her and is not cut out to be a single father, Betty drops the kids off on Dan's doorstep, leaving for the weekend. Dan is not home and has no previous knowledge of her plans.
She told me he thinks he can run off with this younger woman and think he's going to play house with her while I'm left with the children to take care of them. He can have the children and see what it's like. It backfired. It backfired.
Dan sees Betty's actions as irresponsible. He won't let their children go back to her home.
All she ever wanted to do was be a wife and a mother and to be Mrs. Dan Broderick.
But some say Betty refused to take the kids back. Dan serves her with divorce papers. The vicious cycle will soon prove deadly. Coming up, Betty becomes her own worst enemy. In 1985, Betty Broderick moves into the dream house she has always wanted, overlooking a beautiful Pacific cove. But she's the only one living there. A deadly spiral has begun.
The fact that he took my kids just blew me away. Why would he want those kids? He doesn't want those kids. He doesn't care about them. They're underfoot.
But now it's Betty who's getting in the way. One day she stops by Dan's house to pick up the kids. In the kitchen, she spots a dessert made by Linda, and it lights a fuse.
I didn't know Linda was in my house and sleeping in my house and meeting my kids and stuff. I said, oh, is that so? Linda made the cake. So I took it upstairs and smushed it all over his bed just to be a...
Dan doesn't find it funny. Instead, he resorts to what he knows best, the law, and takes out a restraining order. Kim and Lee are now in high school. Danny is only 9 and Rhett is just starting first grade. And Betty can't even pick them up for visits.
And that was just the pattern. My dad would put restrictions and rules on my mom, and mom would purposely, break them.
She claims she can't find proper legal representation in San Diego because Dan, who is one of the city's best attorneys, is part of a powerful old boy network. After all, she says, this is what he has boasted about to her for years.
I knew about my husband's influence in those courts, super influence. And so I knew that no matter what I did, no matter what I said, no matter what the law, the proof, the evidence, I was never getting anything ever.
In an attempt to move on, 37-year-old Betty forges a relationship with Brad Wright, a fencing contractor 6 years her junior. And though Brad becomes a shoulder to cry on, Betty persists in her campaign of sabotage, even using her son as her accomplice.
I was like 7 years old. Like, do I want to go off-roading all over Dad's bushes? Yeah.
Dan responds to each act with a legal summons, forcing her to appear before a judge to explain her actions. In February of 1986, Dan gets a court order allowing him to sell the old family home at Coral Reef without Betty's consent. Betty is furious and immediately drives over to Dan's new house to confront him. He tells her she has 10 seconds to get off his property.
I said, all I want to know is, who did you sell the house to? How much did you get? And where's my half? 7, 6, 5.
Betty is furious. This time, it's potentially life-threatening. She rams her Suburban through Dan's front door. When police arrive, Betty's so out of control that they put her into a straitjacket. She spends 3 days in a mental health facility.
We discussed and even advised Dan to leave town. And Dan's position then, and his position always, was that if Betty really wanted to kill him, she was going to be able to do it wherever he was.
Soon, Betty discovers a new arena in which to spew her spite, Dan's answering machine. She rants and raves, leaving messages containing the most unmentionable of names.
What's this? We can't come to the phone. You're not supposed to come to the phone at the house. You're supposed to go at the house, answer the phone at the office.
Betty was doing things out of desperation. Dan was doing things out of control. So he knew which buttons to push.
In July of 1986, Dan obtains a divorce from Betty without her permission. He now has temporary custody of the kids until the final settlement. The judge rules Betty is not allowed visitation until she gets psychological counseling.
And I didn't know one parent could go in an empty courtroom and get sole custody, no visitation of all 4 minor children without any testimony from anyone.
In November of 1986, instead of her $9,000 monthly support check, Betty receives a bill from Dan for $1,300 in fines he has imposed on her misbehavior. Outraged, she drives to his house to confront him and winds up jailed for the first time.
I do remember saying, please go for help. Here's a name.
After trying several times to point out to Betty bashers that there are 2 sides to every story, Wilma receives an ominous letter from Dan in which he tries to blackmail her with false accusations of an affair.
Dan Broderick got what he wanted. He could be charming, and he could be as awful as he was in that letter.
In 1987, Betty briefly sees a court-ordered therapist who tells Dan she thinks Betty is a physical threat to him.
She felt like her life was sort of on hold while Dan's never missed a beat.
Dan is now president of the San Diego Bar Association. Meanwhile, Betty feels as if she is slowly being destroyed. She begins receiving demeaning ads for fat and wrinkle creams in the mail. One day, she gets a picture of a smiling Dan and Linda with the words, "Eat your heart out, bitch." She is sure Linda sent these notes.
I say, let's assume that she did. So what?
In May of 1988, 2 journalists from the San Diego Reader, a local newspaper, are assigned to cover the Broderick divorce. Betty is happy to talk. Though he has turned down requests by others, surprisingly, Dan agrees to an interview.
I felt that he was amazingly open. He told us that there were ways in which he had seriously failed as a husband.
He had an agenda in that interview, and it was to knock down all our reasons for doing the story and get us not to do it.
Inexplicably, Dan threatens to sue the paper for invasion of privacy if it runs the full story. But he says one thing that haunts both reporters long after.
He said, "This isn't going to be over until one of us is dead."
When the divorce settlement finally comes in January of 1989, it's poisonous to Betty. She has been representing herself, hoping for $1 million cash settlement. Instead, The judge says she owes Dan $750,000 to cover their joint debts. She's to get a payment of $28,000 plus monthly alimony of $16,000.
This is not a judgment that you would look at and any sane person would say, well, it was divided fairly. She got destroyed.
Betty is livid. She feels this is a mere pittance compared to all the hard work she has put in helping Dan become a multimillionaire.
This is all a fabrication to somehow make it appear as if, woe is me, I'm getting $16,000 a month and I'm being beat up in this legal system.
Dan gets to keep full custody of the boys. Betty claims this is the biggest blow. It is all she wants. Instead, for the first time since 1986, she gets official visitation rights, as well as custody of 17-year-old Lee, and hopes that Dan might agree to give her custody of the boys in the fall. But a new family is emerging from the rubble. Dan and Linda, who have announced their engagement, start to plan their April wedding. With a month to go before the big day, Betty makes a purchase that will forever alter all of their lives. She buys a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson. She says it's for self-protection. Coming up,
Everybody was very concerned about Betty and her because she'd been threatening to kill Dan.
This is Headliners and Legend. Dan Broderick versus Betty Broderick. One of the nastiest divorces San Diego has ever seen is finally over. As for their kids, Dan has custody of their sons. Betty gets to see them on weekends. Daughter Lee is on her own, and Kim is away at college. And the grown-ups, Dan and his new bride Linda are planning for the future. But what about Betty?
I was suicidal. I could see no way out. I could see no light at the end of the tunnel. I had exhausted everything. I just totally lost my way in the total darkness, whoa.
Then, on November 4th, 1989, come two letters that send Betty over the edge. A lawyer in Dan's firm implies that she might be jailed for contempt of court. Her dream of regaining full custody of her children seems in jeopardy. When her boys arrive for a weekend visit, the mood is clear.
I remember the day of, she was totally upset when we got there.
As Betty keeps rereading the letters, her sense of desperation grows. She goes to bed early and falls asleep in her clothes. Boyfriend Brad and the boys stay up watching television. Later, Rhett climbs into bed with his mom. On the other side of town, Dan and Linda have dinner with friends at a Mexican restaurant. The couple discuss their hopes of having a baby and, after dinner, go home to bed. Meanwhile, Betty can't sleep. She gets up, rereads the letters, writing on them, "I can't take this anymore." She is exhausted by years of an emotionally draining battle. She is truly at the end of her rope.
By the time those letters came, the same cycle of abuse over and over, I ran out of how to deal with things on that day, on that morning.
She leaves the house and gets into her red Suburban.
I meant to go kill myself at the beach first, and it kicked in that the boys are really going to be mad at me if I do this.
She drives to Dan and Linda's house. The gun is in her purse. She lets herself into Dan's house with her eldest daughter's keys. The gun in hand, she climbs the stairs and enters Dan and Linda's bedroom.
So I go over there one last time and say, okay, just please give me these kids and leave me alone. Please just leave me alone. I was just, whoa.
But Betty's actions tell a different story. The room is dark. Dan and Linda are asleep in their bed. She fires, and then again, and then 3 more times. Next to Dan's side of the bed is a phone. She pulls it out of the wall and leaves. She drives, but doesn't know where she's going, and at around 7 a.m., ends up at a phone booth. Her first call is to a friend who, shocked, immediately calls Brad.
Her words were that Betty had phoned her and said that she had shot Dan and Linda, but she didn't know if they were alive or what their current state was.
Brad and a family friend drive over to Dan and Linda's house.
And we rang the bell and, received no response. So we decided to climb in through a window to go inside and see. And, at that point is when we discovered, that in fact, they both had been shot and that we were the first ones to arrive there.
One of the most prominent lawyers in San Diego has been murdered. Police have issued an all-points bulletin for the victim's ex-wife.
They were found shot to death in the master bedroom of their residence here. He was on the floor next to the bed. She was lying on the bed.
Dan is hit once in the back, and Linda is shot through her chest and the back of her head. That evening, Betty turns herself into police. She spends her first night in custody under suicide watch. Rhett, 10, and his brother, 13, are not told at first that their father is dead, only that he has been shot by Betty.
Me and my brother were just crying, and waiting for the bad news.
Images of all three Brodericks are flashing across TV sets around San Diego.
The cold-blooded murders of Daniel Broderick and his wife continue to send shockwaves throughout our city.
The San Diego Reader finally prints the full story on the Broderick divorce.
She will face 2 counts of homicide.
Crime reporters are stalking this beat with particular enthusiasm and hyperbole. And friends of the victims regret not convincing them to tighten their security.
And I'll never forget what he said to me. He said, "I don't believe she would ever kill me. That's all just threats."
Several weeks after her 42nd birthday, Elizabeth Ann Broderick is arraigned on 2 counts of first-degree murder.
And Ms. Broderick, how do you plead to counts 1 and 2, guilty or not guilty?
She pleads not guilty to both. A year passes before her trial, and for Betty, prison is like much-needed R&R. She sends letters to her friend Wilma, stating that she can finally breathe, she can finally sleep. She also settles on a defense lawyer whose expertise is women who kill. Jack Early says Betty is suffering psychological trauma. Mr. Early will be up against prosecuting DA Kerry Wells, who paints Betty as a woman driven by jealous rage. Opening arguments get underway on October 22nd, 1990.
Elizabeth Broderick stood in their bedroom at the side of their bed. She then took the .38 caliber revolver, pointed it at their sleeping bodies, and unloaded it into them.
Why would somebody from Betty's background act the way she did? We just wanted the jurors to ask the question.
The answers Early contends are that Betty was a wonderful mom and housewife, driven to kill by years of emotional battery from an abusive husband.
By telling Elizabeth Broderick that she was fat, that she was ugly, that she was unwanted, he knew that he was removing her status as a wife.
Because of the intense public interest, the judge opens the trial to the media.
Every morning we would have a line of people, 50 to 75 people long outside the courtroom, wanting to come in and watch the proceedings.
Local viewers prefer television coverage of the trial to their usual dose of daytime drama.
He was in his own mind and in her mind telling her that you are no longer my wife.
With each tear of the Velcro, Early gradually reveals how a beautiful woman with her life in front of her becomes the puffy, sad, and possessed woman in her mugshot. On San Diego radio, a jingle about Betty is a constant refrain on the airwaves.
4 obscene calls, 3 use 2 extra chins, and a car driven through the front door.
The prosecution calls their most important witness, Kim Broderick, Dan and Betty's eldest daughter, who shared a close relationship with her father.
She'd throw things at him. She threw a stereo at him, and at dinner one night she threw a ketchup bottle at him.
In very emotional testimony, she gives damaging evidence against her mother. It is clearly a painful moment for them both. Kim recounts the first conversation she had with her mother after the murders.
You know, I had to do it. I had no other choice. I couldn't let him win. One of us had to die.
There are witnesses to bolster each side's case. Each swears to tell the whole truth and nothing but. And so it goes until October 30th, when Betty takes the stand. Coming up,
I wanted to die, and I had no plan. I just wanted to just die. That's it. That's the end of the story.
the atmosphere in the San Diego courtroom is charged on the day Betty Broderick takes the stand in her own murder defense. She struggles to control her emotions.
I've been put through this bullshit since I was 35. 7 years of my life wasted.
No one knows exactly what to expect.
He was telling people I was crazy. I went crazy. I was like this, and you see pictures of me like this, you know, like I'm some kind of an electrified crazy person.
Her testimony lasts 4 whole days. She recounts to a hushed courtroom how she was driven to suicide over the state of her marriage and her husband's repeated lies about his affair.
I slit my wrists and swallowed every pill I could find in the house. I don't know.
But the prosecution paints Betty as far from helpless. They introduce tapes of her foul-mouthed answering machine messages, and even more damaging, they play a recorded conversation of Betty talking to a young Danny.
We're the best family in the whole world. We were all so happy. All the kids and me were so happy.
I know we're going to be a lot happier if you just stop saying bad words.
Or you tell that slime ball.
See what I mean, Mom? You're saying it right now. You better stop.
The defense is further hindered by the reluctant testimony of Lee Broderick, Dan and Betty's other daughter.
She was hitting him on the head with her keys, her other key ring, with a big brass key ring, and he kind of was trying to get me out of the way, and he kind of pushed me aside and punched her in the chest.
The defense summons an expert who says he believes Betty has been abused not only emotionally, but physically and sexually too.
Well, that he would physically abuse her?
She always excused him by saying he didn't do it on purpose, and while he was flailing his arms, he hit her in the eye.
I wanted to kill myself right in front of him and just splash my brains all over his goddamn house.
Finally, after 3.5 weeks, the trial comes to a close.
I wanted to die, and I had no plan. I just wanted to just die. That's it. That's the end of the story.
The jury's deliberation lasts 4 days, and the result is a deadlock. 10 for murder, 2 for manslaughter.
This time, ladies and gentlemen, I'll declare mistrial in this case.
Supporters of Dan and Linda are furious the jury can't reach a decision.
It was evident that the jury, in some way, felt that Dan and Linda deserved to be killed.
Betty goes back to jail, seemingly content at the thought of another year in which to collect her thoughts.
Mrs. Broderick, anything at all to say? What do you think about the verdict?
Shortly before her second trial commences, video of Betty being dragged, kicking and screaming out of her cell is broadcast all over San Diego. Early is outraged and says the whole thing is a setup, staged to make Betty look bad and unnerve her the day before a scheduled jailhouse interview with ABC's 2020. Betty's second trial begins on October 15, 1991. And if the first trial was simply a media event, this one is a media circus with gavel-to-gavel coverage on court TV.
No, I remember the noise of the gun.
It was amazing when they watched the case on TV, how many witnesses came out of the woodwork that knew things about the case who had been silent.
One of the important witnesses who comes forward claims that Dan was thinking of killing Betty.
Mr. Broderick solicited the murder.
That's
Mr. Early,
not correct.
That's not correct, Mr. Early. They're doing that for posturing for the benefit of the press that's in the courtroom.
The witness never takes the stand.
We're talking about...
That's not fair, Judge. Come on. Do something about this.
The judge declares the testimony is not pertinent. He also limits the use of the defense's main expert on battered women, ruling he can't testify to Betty's physical and sexual abuse because Betty herself has testified that there was none. Early feels the judge keeps eliminating his evidence.
I'm trying to get you now, Mr. Early.
And to make matters worse, this time around, he still can't minimize the negative impact of Kim Broderick's testimony.
And she said she was going to shoot him. And she was going to shoot him in the head.
Perhaps the most incriminating evidence is that about the murders given by Betty herself.
And somebody screamed, "Call the police," and I said, "No!" And I just fired the gun, and this big noise went off.
But in the first trial, her testimony is different. She specifically remembers 5 shots.
I remember the real loud noise 5 times.
She has embellished her story. She has tried to make it sound better because it wasn't quite good enough last time.
In her closing statement, Wells tells the jury that in every way, this is a premeditated crime.
Ladies and gentlemen, if that isn't murder, I don't know what is.
Jack resorts to props, using a metronome to demonstrate the slow tick, tick of emotional abuse Betty suffered.
Somebody who was pounded,
and pounded and pounded.
4 days later, the jurors in the second trial of California versus Elizabeth Ann Broderick have come to a unanimous decision.
We, the jury, in the above entitled cause, find the defendant, Elizabeth Ann Broderick, guilty of the crime of murder.
Betty is convicted of 2 counts of second-degree murder. On February 7th, 1992, she is sentenced to the maximum, 2 consecutive terms totaling 32 years to life in prison. Coming up, Betty's story is made for television. More than 2 years after she murders Dan and Linda Broderick, the fate of Elizabeth Ann Broderick has finally been decided. She begins her 32-year-to-life sentence as prisoner number W42477. She will not have the possibility of parole for at least 19 years. Betty seems unfazed, even interested in her new prison life, writing her friends letters with the details.
After all this was over, she started calling herself a normal person. It's been so long and so dragged out that she didn't remember what a normal life was.
He told you that you were fat and old and boring and stupid? He said
yes,
those words
and he
to you?
didn't like our home, and he didn't like our children.
But for the media, none of this is normal, and the sensation continues. A month after her sentence begins, she appears on The Oprah Winfrey Show, and CBS broadcasts A Woman Scorned, a made-for-television movie on Betty's life, starring Meredith Baxter.
Hello, darling.
The movie purports to portray Betty from the time she and Dan are well established in San Diego through to the murders themselves. It's so popular that it is quickly followed by Part 2, Her Final Fury, which starts with the murders and finishes with Betty going to prison after 2 trials.
What happened so fast? It was all so fast. Obviously, it wasn't. It took 5 shots for you to shoot these people.
Prosecutor Kerry Wells is consulted on the film and even makes a cameo appearance. Betty refuses to watch the movies. She desperately resents them and is angry someone can portray her without ever meeting her.
The DA wanted people to think that I was this stuck-up, rich, you-know-what, socialite, that I lived in this very fancy home. I drove a very fancy car, a Mercedes. I wore fancy clothes, and that this whole case happened because my husband left me for a younger woman, and I shot 2 sleeping people in bed. That is all wrong. Totally wrong. I'd think it was funny, too, if I wasn't sitting in prison.
And it is in prison, as a member of the group Convicted Women Against Abuse, that she meets inmates who share similar crimes and, she feels, similar motives.
When I was on trial and the expert came and was telling me I was a battered woman, I was arguing with him. I said, no, I wasn't. No, I wasn't. He didn't hit me. He didn't hit me. Because like everyone else, that's all I thought battering consisted of, was what's on the end of your arm and hitting someone. Without that defense, you have no defense.
Betty is now an advocate for these issues, sending letters to the governor and finding research to support the battered woman's defense.
Emotional abuse is putting you down, calling you names, making you feel like you're crazy. I didn't even write this. Look at that.
And on the outside, Betty has her supporters too. She has a following and gets fan mail. Betty's story seems to strike a chord with people who identify with her claims of abuse and support her actions. Wilma remembers meeting an acquaintance whose husband had also left her for another woman.
She said, Wilma, I have to tell you something from my heart. Betty only did what every other woman in her position would like to do, but never has the guts or courage to do.
Sharon Blanchet, now a divorce attorney, resents how Betty's actions have been interpreted.
It's a woman who was enraged and murdered 2 people in their bed. And that's what the story is about. It doesn't deserve to be glorified.
Nonetheless, she still sees clients who feel Betty is a martyr.
Yes. I have women who come into my office who feel that they haven't gotten a fair deal. And they say, well, you know, I'm just like Betty Broderick.
In 1994, a California state appeals court upholds her conviction, and the California Supreme Court denies a further appeal. Though disappointed, Betty is resigned.
Lily sent me one of my daughters a watercolor of the magnificent view from the deck of my home. And she said, don't you miss it, Mom? And I said, well, no, If you could turn the clock back and put me on that deck, and I was as miserable and unhappy and scared and afraid and desperate as I was, no, rather be here. I'm safe here.
After more than a decade behind bars, Betty has still never truly expressed remorse of any kind.
I never, for a nanosecond ever, intended or meant or thought about shooting anyone, much less killing anyone. You know, it was just never, it was not a thought process here. And so I never made a decision that I'm so horribly sorry was the wrong decision. I never made a decision.
I think she's afraid to let go that the word remorse and regret takes away how she got to where she is and places 100% responsibility on her.
She's never said in a sentence, I regret what I did, or I'm sorry for killing your dad.
All 4 Broderick children have their own individual feelings on the situation, but they all talk to their mom on the phone and visit her on occasion. Rhett says she still gives him motherly advice, get a haircut, treat your girlfriends well. But eventually, the subject of Dan always comes up.
Every time I have to read her letters, the part where it goes into ranting and raving, I just want to say to her, you've killed them. Isn't that enough? Can you stop bashing them in their graves?
Nonetheless, Rhett doesn't believe his mother is a threat to anyone.
I love my mom. I want her back. It's time to have mom come home.
And Betty has hope. In October of 2000, the state of California's Board of Prison Terms announces they will review the cases of all prisoners who claim to be victims of battered women's syndrome or domestic violence. But Betty's claims of abuse are still the subject of debate.
Betty's emotional abuse was her own making. So I do not believe that she should be given any leniency.
Betty was a battered woman, and it was not necessarily in the traditional sense that people think about it, but Betty was a battered woman.
As part of the review of her case, Betty completes the first step of the process, a face-to-face interview with a prison official. The meeting reinforces her feeling that she will never escape the influence on her life of the television movies.
The investigator admitted she had seen those movies about me. Betty Broderick walks in, and I already know about her because I saw the movies. And so I didn't get really a fair hearing.
So Betty waits and reflects.
I could look back all the time and cry all the time over so much loss to all of us. But what good would it do? And I was not the one who broke up the marriage and had the affair and destroyed the family. I didn't do that, and I didn't keep this all going. I never filed a paper. I reacted and I defended myself. That was my role in this. I wasn't the actor, I was the reactor. In a sense, the victim. Hello.
Betty Broderick won't be eligible for parole until 2010. Close observers generally feel that she certainly won't get it unless she can show remorse for her crime. Broderick has served more than 12 years behind bars. That would be long enough for her to be released if she had been convicted of manslaughter. I'm Lester Holt. Thanks for watching, everyone.
For information on upcoming programs, go to prime.msnbc.com.